Today's program is devoted to a very serious subject. The conflict that began in Ukraine has been expanding and involving more and more countries. Russia, Europe, the United States. Wherever you live in the world, you've probably heard about this. But you might start to become affected by it if the conflict grows. Some people believe that it might be the start of World War III. And unlike the first two world wars, this one could involve nuclear weapons, an exchange between the two largest nuclear stockpiles in the world, those of Russia and the United States. Hopefully, it won't get to that point, but this presentation is about exploring how it came about, the history of the conflict, and what each of the players were doing and why they reacted the way they did. If you're interested in hearing more than just one side of the story, if you're listening and you're curious about what happened and how did different groups react, then keep watching. In the second half of this program, we're going to have Noam Chomsky, and we're going to have a discussion about the war as it's going today. Before I begin, I do want to mention an eerie coincidence that people discovered back in March or even in February. The dates of World War I and World War II and World War III potentially might have something in common. World War I started officially on July 28, 1914. You could see it here. If you sum up 7, 28, 19, and 14, you get 68. Now, World War II officially started September 1st, 1939. And again, if you sum up 9, 1, 1939, you also get 68. The eerie part is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine took place and started on February 24th, 2022. And if you sum these numbers, they also sum to 68. And some people believe there's some kind of weird numerological coincidence here, and it gives them more reason to believe that this invasion is just the start of World War III. Hopefully not. And one most important thing is to understand the other side, understand other people in other countries, and try to come to a compromise. Unfortunately, today, this is not happening. Back when we had a nuclear scare during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was averted. It was averted by John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, leaders of the United States and, at that time, the USSR. Now, there was a lot dividing those two countries, perhaps more than today. After all, the USSR was a communist country. They had a completely different outlook on what the economic system should be. The United States and the USSR had engaged in a Cold War for many years and almost came to huge escalation, to perhaps nuclear war. After averting it, this was Kennedy's speech, and I want to start here. Here's what Kennedy said at an address. This was a speech that, in fact, was heard by Khrushchev, and within months, the United States and Russia had established a direct line, had started to draw down a lot of their weapons, and in fact, worked on helping normalize relations, all because of this speech. Let's listen.
So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity.
Now, this is his famous phrase here.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment.
I do want to contrast what he's saying with what's happening today. Are we pointing blame? What's more important to us? De-escalation and peace efforts, or blaming and escalating today? What is the end goal? Listen to what Kennedy said back then, the man who helped avert a nuclear crisis back then.
We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests.
Above all, he says,
nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.
So Kennedy warned about pushing an adversary to essentially a choice, either a humiliating defeat, 100% defeat, or nuclear war. Today's policy seems to be to push Russia to 100% defeat. Russia, 100% defeated. This is pretty much the only outcome that would be accepted by the United States. It's also the outcome that Ukraine wants, of course. But when asked, what is the end game? How long will we be participating as the United States? The answer is, as long as it takes. So this, according to Kennedy, is a collective death wish for the world. But perhaps today's leaders can avert it in some other way. Today, we have the following headlines. American troops prepared to engage in war with Russia. This is Newsweek. A provocative headline talking about what is essentially, at this point, exercises that are taking place with allied and partner nations here. NATO exercises right outside of Russia. So this was October 26th. We see here that we're talking about essentially exercises to send a message. But also not just to send a message, but to start bringing troops there. We have here NBC News, U.S. military inspectors in Ukraine to keep further track of weapons and equipment. The inspectors appear to be among the first U.S. military members to officially enter Ukraine since Russia invaded. So again, will it be limited to this, or is this a growing trend? Remember, Biden said that we would not engage Russia on the ground in Ukraine because, according to him, that would be the start of World War III. Well, now, some of these things are being rethought. Bloomberg reports, recent, Pentagon's strategy has changed. It will now no longer rule out nuclear use against non-nuclear threats. Where Biden once said that there would be limits and we would only respond after someone launched a nuke, now we're not ruling out nuclear threats. This is a nuclear force against non-nuclear threats. So the United States is essentially ramping up its stance, its position. It's very interesting as to why it's doing it. Of course, China is another player in all of this, and China just announced, Xi Jinping announced that he's going to prepare for war. With whom? So we're talking about perhaps Taiwan, who the United States also said it's going to defend. So whether it's Nancy Pelosi traveling to Taiwan or whether it's John McCain traveling to Ukraine, these actions might in fact inflame tensions that are already there. So let's go through the history of the Ukraine, Russia, the rest of the world conflict, and let's see how it began. Let's talk about all the different players here. And if you're interested in an actual history using mainstream sources only, then let's go through it together before we have Noam Chomsky join us for the second half of the show. All right. So depending on where you live, you're going to hear different one-sided narratives. If you live in Russia, you're going to hear a very Russo-centric narrative, which I'm going to cover some of it here. If you live in the United States, you are not hearing a lot of things either, and you're having usually one-sided reporting unless you're going to non-mainstream sources. But it wasn't always the case. I'm going to give the history of this conflict only using mainstream sources. And one way you could do that is when you type in Google, all you have to do is do before, and then you give a date such as 2015, 0102. And then it will give you articles. For example, Ukraine, Donetsk. And let's go to 2014, 05, 08. This great trick allows you to see articles from that time, news articles about what is happening. Anyway, so let's go ahead and talk about only mainstream news, and let's start at the beginning. Here's a map of Europe. You could see Ukraine here. But let's talk about who lives in this country. What do they believe? How do they feel? And let's talk about also the countries around it. If we back up and we talk about, for example, the beginning and the national consciousness of Russia and Ukraine, all right, you're going to see here the golden hordes of the Mongols, okay? And what you have here, sort of these old duchies of Muscovy, which became Moscow, and Novgorod. All right, and here you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire later, but here we're talking about essentially the year 1372. We have here the Holy Roman Empire. If you go a little further back, you could see here Poland, very old country, Hungary, and these were the Russians. Okay, these were people that essentially the Mongol Empire was their big enemy. They have stories of being raped, enslaved, killed, and so on by the Mongols. Now, if you go a little further, right, if you go further, you're going to see the rise of countries here. Poland, Lithuania becomes a big thing. And then you see the Duchy of Muscovy, essentially founded by this guy, Alexander Nevsky, I believe. It had a series of princes. Ivan the Terrible, if you heard of him, he was the guy who eventually unified what was known back then as Kievan Rus. So this guy, Ivan the Terrible, is essentially a ruler of Grand Duchy of Moscow. He decided that he was going to essentially take over all of the known Russia. And the translation "terrible" is a terrible translation. In fact, it's kind of an archaic translation. It actually means Grozny is like he's stern or to be feared. But what I want to show here is Kievan Rus. So here's Russia, here's the Muscovy Duchy, and basically Kiev was around here. Kiev was one of the early civilizations of Russia over here, all right, like Kiev. But then what happened was essentially you could see that Russia and Moscow sort of started growing and taking over, and eventually all these people spoke a sort of Slavic derivative of Russian, and the Cyrillic actually came from Kirill and Methody, who were from Bulgaria. So essentially what you have here now is people who lived under Poland and people who lived in this growing country called Russia. As you go further out, you see that Poland and Russia, they keep sort of going back and forth. Russia eventually takes a lot of this territory. Ukrainian Cossacks are also another group that form sort of some of the lineages in Ukraine. You had here Saxony for a while, and then you had the Russian Empire under the Romanovs, okay, which, by the way, were interbreeding with Great Britain and other kings eventually, and around the 19th century they had a lot of hemophilia in their family as well. So as you could see, the Russian Empire grew a lot, and the people who lived in this area came under the influence of Russia, and Poland at this point was taken over as well. So a lot happening in this area of the world. Austro-Hungary, okay, was fighting with the Ottoman Empire and so on. Then came a big thing, World War I, right? Okay, so let's go to World War I. Essentially, what happened here is you had a bunch of countries all fighting each other, and after the war, there's no more Ottoman Empire. Turkey, Ottoman Empire becomes Turkey. What happens to all its neighbors? Well, its neighbors resent it. If you look at the history of Turkey, the Turks committed, some may say genocide, for example, against Armenians. The Armenian genocide. Turks, many of them say, Cenk Uygur used to say this, that no, it was a civil war and the Armenians were actually fighting too. The fact is that there was a systematic destruction of the Armenian people and identity. And it wasn't just Armenians. It was other Christians. For example, Turkey and Greece. Greek genocide. Turkey. So you can imagine that Anatolian Greeks and others were not very happy with Turkey. And even the Kurds who at the time helped Turkey to carry out some of these atrocities, were not happy with Turkey. And so essentially what happened was you got a big empire, fell apart, and then all these countries harbored resentments towards this major country that was part of the empire. That will be a recurring theme here. So you see, as it goes on, what happened was after World War I, the communists took over, ended World War I because it was a disastrous war for the Russian Empire. It became the Soviet Union. So right after this World War I, not only did the Ottoman Empire become Turkey, but very shortly afterwards, Russia became Soviet Union. What many people don't know is that the Soviet Union was then invaded, intervention into USSR revolution. We're talking about that time. Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. Okay? This is how many countries intervened, and they weren't able to prevail. In fact, on their own turf, the Bolsheviks and essentially the Reds won and essentially took over Russia. But not before 20 million people died. Again, very important to understand. When a civil war is perpetuated and you keep it going and you don't, one side is not stronger than the other for a while, a lot of people die. And so there was a lot of bloody killing in the Civil War. Afterwards, the Soviet Union continued. And as you could see, after World War II, it controlled quite a bit of territory. Now, there was a blip here where Germany controlled a lot. And this was another time of upheaval. And Ukraine, which essentially is the country here, has a lot of history with this. They also remember something else, the Holodomor. Holodomor is the Ukrainian pronunciation of what Russians would say Golodomor. But essentially, this is the letter H or G, was a famine that happened during Stalin's time, during the Great Collectivization. Now, this famine is similar to, for example, the Great Famine of China, which happened under Mao. But to the Ukrainians, and especially the nationalists who wanted Ukraine to be its own country, to them, it was a genocide. It was a way for Stalin to crush the nationalism of Ukraine. I'm not going to go into the various iterations. Ukraine always had a chance during World War I, World War II, to sort of have a bit of a country. Actually, I'm just going to say that Ukraine SSR, the Soviet Socialist Republic, it was one of the founding members. But right before this republic came to be, there was actually a revolutionary Ukraine before USSR. For 1 year, it had experienced a brief period of independence. And the Cossacks and others were anti-communist. It was ruled by, because portions were ruled by Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and so on. But finally, what happened was that Ukraine became absorbed part of the Soviet Union, but because they were one of the founding republics of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was essentially a bunch of states, just like the European Union or the U.S. or whatever, colonies. They got together. So this is the history of Ukraine, and up until the point. So Holodomor, like I said, was a famine. What people don't understand, because they don't look around the world, is that there were also other famines, like the Irish potato famine. Some people blame things like communism for the famines, and they're right. Collectivization and the state trying to collectivize things resulted in mass death. But also, explicitly capitalist projects which protected the private property of landlords also ended up in the famine, and also were part of large countries, imperialist countries, like at the time, United Kingdom, UK, essentially dominating neighboring countries that were part of it, I guess, which in this case was Ireland. Mass starvation and disease. You can also see some empires going halfway around the world. The UK Empire, British Empire, is the empire in which the sun never set, they said. And so they had the British Raj. And a lot of this is driven, again, by state capitalism. This idea that the British East India Company, right, would extract profits from this region, India, which now, is split into Pakistan, India, whatever, Bangladesh, and other countries, basically, which before was just India. So under the British Raj, again, there was domination. And you could see even in the 20th century, when you had Holodomor, you also had the Bengal famine, for example, in Bangladesh. There were several of these, in fact. And the latest one was after Holodomor. And you could see 2.1 to 3.8 million Bengalis perished. Again, if you look at this, it's about state domination. Whether it's communism or capitalism, it can lead to a lot of economic trouble and really bad failure modes, really bad famines. But anyway, a lot of this was experienced through the lens of nationalism. So take a look at this. Would you, given all of this timeline, anywhere in history, if you were told to kill other people and to get your family in harm's way, just so that the flag of Poland, for example, would always fly here, well, you'd be wrong. It wouldn't fly there anymore. Or if the flag of the Habsburgs would fly here, well, here's Saxony for a while. My point simply is that if you're aware of history, you're much less inclined to worry about which flag flies over what territory, and you're more interested in the people and how they can be safe and go to work and the next day, regardless of who provides their roads and services and so on. In fact, countries should serve people, but the United Nations is composed of countries and delegates of countries. Countries are not interested in others gaining independence from them. And so even in the United Nations, there's not a lot of support for things like, for example, Catalonia referendum of, let's say, 2017. Catalonia has long wanted to become independent of Spain, and they voted to do so. As you could see here, the overwhelmingly, they wanted to become independent. Well, Spain didn't care, right? It doesn't matter. It was suspended by the Constitutional Court of Spain. They also arrested a lot of people. You could look at the protests in Catalonia, arrests Spain, and you can see all the kinds of things that happens there. Now, you could also see that same year, Kurds independence referendum. Similar thing, the Kurds of Iraq wanted to form their own independent country. You could see how many people come together for these kinds of things. But again, completely denied. If you look even at neighboring countries like Erdogan, Turkey, opining about this referendum, what do you think he's going to say? He's going to say, totally illegitimate. There we go. Illegitimate, and this was a few years ago, right? Territorial integrity is the name of the game. So, since the formation of the UN, this idea of territorial integrity really rules the day. And the idea is that we could even risk nuclear war, like we're talking about here.
Nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.
Well, today we're talking about territorial integrity. So that means all of history, when all of this was changing, today's view is that it will be static forever. Whatever is happening here is just to essentially preserve exactly this map. You could escalate as much as you want. Now, that is not strictly true. For example, NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. If you look at the bombing of Yugoslavia under President Clinton in 1999.
The borders of the world are constantly changing. Empires rise and empires fall.
Well, that's interesting. Okay. Yes, that's true. But today we are saying it's not changing and we can go ahead and fight a war over this. NATO bombing of Yugoslavia happened because NATO perceived that there was a genocide that was impending or taking place already. And they got involved. They asked the UN if they could, in fact, attack. The United Nations said, no, you cannot. It's against the UN Charter. They also had the 1995 bombing campaign in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But the point is that it was the first time NATO had used military force without the expressed endorsement of the UN Security Council, and thus international legal approval. Not only that, but in fact they did regime change in Yugoslavia, which subsequently fell apart. Also, NATO declared Kosovo independent. Kosovo was subsequently recognized as independent by many countries in the world. Again, some independence movements always aspire for independence, like the Kurds and others. Finally, in 2008, they formally declared independence from Serbia. So some, like Catalonia and Kurds, aren't able to do it. Others, like, for example, the state of Palestine, are recognized by almost as many countries as Israel. If you look at international recognition of the state of Palestine, these are the countries that have recognized it. Now, the reality on the ground could be very different, and the international community is often pushing for a specific outcome. For example, it doesn't allow it doesn't support a lot of democratic elections in the state of Palestine for, let's say, Mahmoud Abbas, or before that, Yasser Arafat. They would prefer to have one leader there in order to try to build this state, because if the people were voting, they might want something else. For example, BDS movement wants a one-state solution with Israel, or so they say. In Gaza, Hamas has a completely different vision. And a lot of times, again, the conflict is actually perpetuated by outside forces, in this case, USSR and USA, in the region. In other talks, I'll talk about this region, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and so on. But in fact, that's a very interesting history. I'll just mention one thing, and then I'll return back and finish the modern history of the Ukraine war. The Jericho Conference was, in fact, something that most people forgot. It was when most of the tribes and Hamullahs of the Palestinian Arabs living in the West Bank of Jordan accepted unto themselves the authority of the King Abdullah of Jordan, which is to say, they voluntarily kind of annexed themselves to Jordan, which was previously called Transjordan and became called Jordan. So you could read about all these kinds of things. But after this stable result, which was as the United States recognized Israel and Jordan the same day, said it represented logical development of the situation, which took place as a free expression of the will of the people. Okay. Afterwards, however, the Arab League resented Jordan for illegally occupying the West Bank, wanted to kick it out of the Arab League, and subsequently trained people who were called Fedayeen, who later, when Jordan and Israel came under in the influence of USA and the Western powers, the USSR decided to instead back Syria and Egypt. And so they trained a lot of the PLO and the liberation organizations and other places like Bolivia in order to undermine, which is now, I guess, called the territorial integrity of these countries. So, in other words, countries always try to sponsor these things in what is called proxy wars. And this is really something that is going on around the world. This is an important concept because this is probably the best description of what has been going on in Ukraine since 2014. Proxy war is essentially where it's an armed conflict between two states or non-state actors, one or both of which act at the instigation on behalf of other parties that are not directly involved in the hostilities. Let's put it this way. Look at here, what do they have to do? The relationship with these large countries usually takes the form of funding, military training, arms, and other forms of material assistance, which assist a belligerent party in sustaining its war effort. So it could be on a small scale, like in Gaza, where you have the Gulf states, for example, helping Hamas with their weaponry, trying to keep them from totally folding. Or it can be like we see in Ukraine. So let's go through the history and we see what's happening since the story can begin around, let's say, 2013. Actually, there's one more thing that's very important to understand. Nationalism is what leads to these conflicts. So if you look at this area right here, the Crimea, if you look at Crimea and what happened is that this little peninsula right here, Crimea, used to be part of the Soviet Union, just like, let's say, New Jersey, right? And so, or maybe a part of New Jersey, right? And so what happened was in 1954, Crimea was transferred from the Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia to the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. In other words, it was simply transferred to the government from the Russian, the Ukrainian, Crimea has a rich history. It had Tatars in there. Prior to this, Turkic Crimean Tatars were deported by Stalin because of tensions and, let's just say, retribution for their role in World War II. I'm not going to get into that, but my main point is, guess what happened when Crimea was sort of gifted or transferred from Russia to Ukraine? Nothing. People didn't kill each other. People considered it to be a mere administrative action. Okay, so they might change the roads, they might change the signs, the maps, whatever, and that was it. Why? Because people didn't have this idea of nationalism, right? So people who lived in Ukraine, let's say, considered themselves part of this larger entity, just like people today who live in New Jersey or New York consider themselves part of the United States. And it would be ludicrous to believe that World War III could start because Staten Island decided to secede from New York and join New Jersey. But unfortunately, once these things fall apart, like Yugoslavia, in this case, the USSR, it leaves behind these groups. And like I said, with Turkey, these groups often resent Russia. Now, people lived here, if you remember, people who lived here were actually part of Poland and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on. So you can understand why people who live here might remember bad things about Russia, including the Holodomor, similarly to how people living in Greece might remember the genocides that they experienced in Turkey, by Turks, I should say. So that's one part of it. And you could see Greece going to the United States and asking for weapons. Even today, United States is the arms dealer, okay? And look, this is happening right now. Turkey is upset because U.S. Is also doing a similar, okay? Turkey and U.S. vie for U.S. goods at the other's expense. Okay, this has been going on for a long time. So again, this thing is happening around the world. In another part of the world, in the Gulf states over here, you've got Iran sponsoring a revolution in around 2013-14, I think, of Houthi rebels in Yemen. And what's happening there is essentially that, I'm not going to get into that as another separate topic, but the Gulf states enjoyed a sort of dominance of Sunni hegemony in Yemen, and all of a sudden, the Shiite Houthi rebels started to take over and replace the government. A similar thing happened in Ukraine, and that's now what I'm going to talk about. But the response by the Saudi coalition in Yemen has led to one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the last 20 years. Worse than Iraq. Yemen facing outright catastrophe. This is this year, over rising hunger. Okay? But this takes a backseat to the conflict in Ukraine. Why? Well, there's many explanations. One is that this happens in Europe, whereas that happens in the Gulf, Arabian Peninsula. So people in the West tend to identify more with Western civilization, I guess. Another reason, and so, if a conflict happens here or in South Asia, it's like whatever, right? But this happens in Europe. That's one. But perhaps a bigger reason is that these countries try to get each other into a quagmire, like when the United States got into Vietnam, or when the United States got into Afghanistan. Other countries try to sponsor the other side to get them involved. The United States could be said to have done the same thing. For example, if you look at Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan, the United States drew the Soviet Union into what was essentially a protracted, years-long proxy war, using Afghan fighters as you could say the fighting, the force to bleed Russia dry. It's not me saying it. Brzezinski, if I could spell it correctly, bleed the Soviets. Okay, so Afghanistan Mujahideen. So these guys, Mujahideen, they're in the office of Ronald Reagan, who called the evil empire, and what basically he talked about was ways to fight it on the world stage. One way that they did that is a proxy war in Afghanistan, where 2 million civilians died. Between 1 and 2 million civilians paid the price for this proxy war. And we were giving them Stinger missiles, we were supplying them covertly, overtly, and there were also foreign fighters called Afghan Arabs coming in. Sound familiar? Afghan Arabs were essentially other Muslim Islamist Mujahideen who came to Afghanistan during and following the Soviet-Afghan war to help fellow Muslims fight against the Soviets. This is Brzezinski talking to the Mujahideen, and watch the similarity between what he said then and what we're saying now.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role.
Pakistan, so Poland would be playing the role of Pakistan here, a neighboring country from which you can launch weapons and help these people, equip them to fight the Soviets.
On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day, because your fight will prevail, and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again, because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis will be to make the
This is Brzezinski saying this.
Soviets bleed for as much and as long.
For as much as long as possible. So again, it's not about helping the Arabs, the Afghans so much. It is actually to make the Soviets bleed. So, of course, doing that kind of stuff, the two great powers, in that case, the United States and the USSR, strenuously avoided direct conflict, like they could have had come to blows over the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's very interesting that these countries are used as a way to sort of get into a conflict, but then there are some war hawks in both countries, Russia and the United States, who go way too far. And I'm talking about war hawks like Hillary Clinton. 2016 election, she was talking about a no-fly zone in Syria. Who remembers this? See, back then, it was Syria that was the theater for Russia. And never mind the fact that Russia was fighting ISIS there, and the United States was fighting ISIS as well. Hillary had the idea that there should be no-fly zones, which means that we would directly engage Russia. And if you go back to 2008, 2009, she was starting to push similar ideas back then. In 2013, she admitted the no-fly zone would kill a lot of Syrians. Still wants one. So this is the attitude that some very prominent people who arguably got the popular vote and could become president had. This is what George W. Bush has to say. George W. Bush is a president that we knew invaded Iraq, which under pretenses that were eventually proven false. We changed the narrative to say we're bringing democracy to Iraq. We're going to be greeted as liberators. This is what Bush accidentally said recently this year about...
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq. Anyway.
Everyone laughs. I wonder who is laughing. It's not funny in Iraq, is it? If you look at excess deaths in Iraq as a result of the U.S. invasion, 1 million excess deaths. You look at by some estimates. Sometimes it's 500,000. Look at civilian casualties in Afghanistan. We're talking about the war in Afghanistan. Brutal 9-year conflict. Estimated 1 million civilians were killed. Civilians, as well as fighters. All right? Now, keep in mind, in many of these conflicts, more civilians are killed than the fighters because the fighters are protected. What's interesting in the Ukraine conflict is that it's actually the reverse. I think that it seems both armies, as much as the media on either side might paint the other army as totally brutal and fascist or Nazis, both listen to the Russian media or listen to the U.S. media. But in fact, in this particular conflict, you don't see things like this. You don't see, for example, devastation like you saw in Syria. Now, Mariupol is often claimed that in Mariupol there is devastation and a lot of buildings were damaged. And while that is true, if you look at people living in Mariupol today, they're able to rebuild. By contrast, if you look at what's happening in Homs, this was drone footage in 2016. The entire city was essentially destroyed in the Syrian civil war. Similarly with Aleppo. Now, also, if you look at the Yemen conflict, what's happening is that this year, a joint Washington Post analysis reveals for the first time, the United States supported the majority of Air Force squadrons, the majority involved in the Saudi coalition's years-long campaign. The problem with this is that hundreds of thousands have died over the years. Also, indirect consequences like hunger. We saw before millions of people in Yemen are currently food insecure, and that's because it is blockaded, like Gaza. Yemen is blockaded. Ukraine is not blockaded, and it's able to get supplies. It's able to get weapons from NATO through, for example, the Polish border. This is not the case in Yemen today, and we should be concerned. Washington Post says, while Russia's bombings of a maternity hospital and other civilian targets in Ukraine have drawn widespread public indignation as war crimes, thousands of similar strikes have taken place against Yemenite civilians. Indiscriminate bombings have become a hallmark of the Yemen war, drawing international scrutiny of the countries participating in the air campaign. Which countries? So this is the problem. The problem of not only the teapot calling, the pot black, the kettle black, but in fact, the teapot is doing this all the time, and we need to stop both Russia, China, United States from being these imperialistic countries. You look at any one of these things, United States, Haiti, right now, there's an idea that the United States needs to invade or intervene in Haiti. Haiti's elites keep asking for U.S. foreign intervention. Right now, it's happening this year. But look at the disastrous history of United States occupation of Haiti. We changed their constitution. We forced them to, when their parliament didn't want to change it, we disbanded their parliament and got one that would get their constitution the way that we wrote it, and then for them. And then later we actually forced their nation to work almost like slaves, if you want to look at this. I mean, unbelievable history. And this is, again, in our backyard. Okay, so now we get to the proximate causes that led to this war in Ukraine. So I want to be, again, clear that countries try to band together because they are afraid of a more powerful country. So in this case, the countries that are all the way around here, including the Baltic countries here in the Baltic Sea, and also over here, a lot of these countries remember how the USSR was hegemon and was, well, yes, the USSR helped these countries form in the first place. The people were already living here and a culture, and they remember being invaded and dominated. So every country, like I said, Turkey, China, United States, has a history of that kind of stuff. It's just that the United States has vanquished all of its enemies. The natives are gone, and like 1/3 of the United States is simply Mexico. So taken from Mexico. So United States, Mexican War. You would find that in fact, all that territory, from California, San Francisco, all the way down to, there we go, okay? I mean, this used to be Mexican territory, okay? Larger than all of current Mexico, I think, remaining. We took a lot of this stuff. Alta California, okay? So everything from San Francisco over here to San Diego, Los Angeles, El Paso, like all these are Spanish names for a reason, right? So the United States simply, 120 years ago, engaged in a very similar war of territory, simply took the territory. So normally this would be, again, I want to emphasize that this would not be a big thing in 1954. It would be an administrative question of who is in charge of a particular region, which republic would be in charge. But now that these republics have been upgraded from republics to countries, right? Republics, countries, they get a national history, they revive, they remember the grievances, and very importantly, they would like their territorial integrity to remain intact forever. None of this, none of that, none of this, forever. Okay? And the international system is more or less predicated towards that. Like I said, the Basque people here, the Catalonians here, they don't count. Their opinions don't really count, because that would undermine territorial integrity of Spain and France. So, again, if you remember Brzezinski, just to, again, play it real quick. Brzezinski, Mujahideen, what is, sorry. This is what he said, and I want to show the similarity between what happened here and what happened in 2013 in Ukraine.
U.S. need to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day, because your fight will prevail, and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again, because your cause is right and God is on your side.
So here's a guy from America coming, preaching to this crowd of people who then are given eventually weapons, and they go ahead and try to take control of their government. So now let's look at what happened. I'm going to get to that. I want to get to the proximate cause. So let's take a look now at John McCain addressing the Ukraine protesters in Kiev. Again, this is 2013 by The Guardian, and I'm going to only use mainstream sources from here on out, as I have been. I don't want to get bogged down in conspiracy theories necessarily, but you never know, right? You don't know. Sometimes conspiracy theories turn out to be true. Like, did the virus, the Wuhan virus, wind up coming from a lab or from a bat in the marketplace? Today we lean towards a lab, but back then, 2 years ago, that was a conspiracy theory. Regardless, check out this.
Ukraine. People of Ukraine, this is your moment.
One moment, sorry. Here we go. Let's put it side by side.
U.S. national security
Believe in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed.
All right, that's Patosh. This is Pashto, I think. Here's John McCain.
Народи український, це ваш момент.
This is about you, no one else.
Це про вас.
This is
It's really also about U.S. interests, right? It's about European interests as well. However, he's appealing to them similarly to how.
That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day.
All right, let me just play the McCain thing here.
This is about the future you want for your country. This is about the future you deserve.
Це про ваше майбутнє, про майбутнє вашої країни. Це про майбутнє, на яке ви заслуговуєте.
A future in Europe.
Майбутнє Європи.
A future of peace. Good
Майбутнє миру.
relations with all of your neighbors.
A future of peace and good relations with all of your neighbors. This was the rhetoric that was sold. But of course, the question is, what is John McCain doing here? He didn't win the election against Obama. He came here as a senator, much like Nancy Pelosi went as a U.S. representative to Taiwan, except there she just met with a few people. Here, there was $5 billion in a concerted effort placed into doing what?
Всіх ваших сусідів.
The free world is with you. America is with you. I am with you.
What is happening here? So Ukraine has a democracy at this moment. Ukraine did have an orange revolution. This was like maybe 7-8 years ago before this, because a lot of Ukraine figured that this guy Yanukovych was a very controversial figure. And if you look at Viktor Yanukovych, he was a politician who he was young, was basically became the president of Ukraine. A political career started in 1996. In the 2004 presidential campaign, he participated in the controversial Ukrainian presidential election. This was his party, the Party of Regions. All right, these are the people that voted the most for him. Now, 2004, what happened was Yanukovych's main base of support emerged from the southern eastern regions of Ukraine, and so on. Now, what happened was after the election, so Yanukovych was initially declared the winner. However, the legitimacy of the election was questioned by many Ukrainians, international organizations, and foreign governments. And then there was widespread protests known as the Orange Revolution. So Yanukovych was already being protested by a lot of people. Eventually, however, so that time there was another election in which he lost. What happened next is that here, Ukraine is a democratic country. Currently, the president and the executive branch is being run by Yanukovych, okay, who, it turns out, was pretty corrupt and a kleptocrat. But then it turned out the people after him were also kleptocrats, like Petro Poroshenko, and some people say Zelensky as well. But that's not the point. The point isn't that the United States is interested in helping Ukraine oust a kleptocrat. If they were interested in that, then they would allow Laos to do so. But instead, when Laos had a revolution against their kleptocrat, I think a king, Lyndon Johnson bombed Laos more than any other country has ever been bombed in history. More than 2 million tons of bombs were dropped. Not only that, but they did it in secret. So the American public, unlike with Iraq, unlike with Vietnam, did not know about this war. Okay, it's a secret war, it's called, in Laos. And this is a poor country. Okay, if you talk about unjustified and unprovoked wars, you could hardly find a country that fit that better than Laos. Had no weapons that could possibly reach the U.S., or even its allies. But there was something called the domino theory, the theory that communism was spreading. And if it was allowed to spread, then other countries would decide that they would also like to be communist. And that represented a threat to the United States' interests and the American way of life, because the American way of life was built on trade agreements and perhaps economic domination. We'll talk about some other time about BRICS countries, BRICS, and how Saudi Arabia now and Turkey are looking to join sort of the alliance of BRICS, which may become larger than the G7, and talk about countries trying to escape U.S. economic hegemony. But right now, we're more interested in talking about how countries are trying to escape Russia's military hegemony by joining a different alliance, NATO. So in Ukraine, you could see that the United States was, in fact, involved in a big way in order to do what? Well, it turned out that the result of this was, again, a revolution, this time to take out the sitting president, topple the executive branch of the current just regime change Ukraine. Again, was that part of this, the intention? I don't know, probably not. In fact, if you read the Revolution of Dignity, it's never quite that simple. The Revolution of Dignity is the name given to this other revolution. It's not the Orange Revolution. It looked like this. If you think that January 6th, some people call it a coup, I think it was, if not, let's just say it like this. The same people that call January 6th a coup do not have much problem with the popular uprising in Ukraine. Typically, this was called a revolution. And in fact, that's what it is. It's a revolution, not necessarily a coup, but it was certainly fomented, or we should say encouraged by the U.S. Again, the question is, what standard do we apply here? If you're going to say that Iran helped the Houthi rebels, well, how did it help them? Anything that we could prove that they did, what did Iran actually do in order to help the Houthi movement? We could say that the United States devoted way more resources to helping the disaffected parts of Ukraine. Now, who are these disaffected parts of Ukraine? One of them is the, here's the Orange Revolution, the Svoboda Party. The Svoboda Party actually in 2012, got 10% of all the votes in Ukraine. The Svoboda Party has an interesting history. The leader of Svoboda, this guy, Oleg Takhnibok, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Takhnibok, he originally in 1991 started a party literally called the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine. This is the Wolfsangel symbol that Nazi Germans used. But again, the social nationalists, the National Socialists, are essentially Nazi party. But Takhnibok actually didn't have much success with this. Although this particular party became infamous for recruiting soccer hooligans and skinheads and a lot of people. Later, he actually mellowed out. By the time he became the leader of Svoboda, which was a party started in 1995, he actually moderated this party. So Svoboda was registered in 1995. It was characterized as a radical right-wing populist party They combine elements of ethnic ultranationalism, anti-communism. During 1990s, it was accused of neo-Nazism due to the party's recruitment of skinheads and usage of neo-Nazi symbols. Eventually, though, the symbols became much more benign. And also, even though it has been widely considered as neo-fascist, neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic by multiple journalists and organizations and so on, some consider them radical right nationalists. Here's what I would like to say and point out, that in the all Ukrainian union, so basically in the parliamentary elections in 2009, they started getting some support. Then you see these tiki torches, a little bit like the Unite the Right rally in the United States. Also, they're not exactly Nazis. Many of them are, there's good people on both sides, right? Anyways, then you got here the 2012 election, and as you could see in these regions, they got 38%, 31%, 33%. These are the regions that are the furthest from Russia and have a different history. They remember history differently. They don't like the Muscovites, and they don't like the people here who they consider, and they call Katsapi, people who are essentially Russophiles, people who are, in their view, collaborators with Russia or fifth column or something like that, and on the side of the oppressor. You can think of them as, these would be Armenians and these would be Kurds, okay, who are buddy-buddy with Turkey, helping to genocide Armenians. That's their point of view. Often people from here did not like the Russian language because it was a symbol of the oppressor. Throughout most of Ukraine, however, this was not the case. I was personally in Kiev a couple of times. Everyone spoke Russian there. I'm talking about like 2018 and so on. This was already after 2014. But if you look at 2012, you see this happening here. You see that the groups here, the lowest amount of support for Svoboda was over here. What do they support over here? You'll find out soon, but you can take a guess. People here, many of them supported even the return of the Soviet Union, which they considered to be a more prosperous time for them, a time when the factories that they worked in were, giving them good jobs and so on. You could think of it as the Rust Belt, right? And people remember the good times. Think of that Billy Joel song, Allentown, right? And where did all the jobs go? And then you've got here people who want to get into Europe, and of course Kiev, big metropolitan city, wants to get into Europe. So does Moscow. They all have aspirations to be part of Europe. If you look at Putin wanted to be part of NATO. The Pope says NATO instigated war and so on. Maybe I get to that. But Putin wanted to be, here we go, ex-head. The head of NATO, who was the head at the time, said that Putin wanted to be a part of NATO. And that's what Putin finally admitted right before invading Ukraine, sadly. Putin, back then, liked Europe. Remember, he was taking over Russia after Yeltsin. Now, another thing, you got to understand Russia's point of view here. Russia was essentially, let me see if this is here. No, it's not here. Okay. I'll have to do this. Okay, so Yeltsin, 1993, there was a constitutional crisis. Because, you see, the Chicago boys and the USA meddled in Russia's elections, let's just say. And moreover, they came to help reform Russia's economy. It was called shock therapy. Okay? Basically, it was a way to replace the Soviet Union's state ownership of resources by private ownerships. It was called privatization. And the promise was that if you allowed non-state owners to own the TV stations and the oil and the resources, then somehow that would lead to more prosperity. Of course, these private owners just sold off a lot of stuff to foreign interests and got villas, in other countries and so on, struck deals. Today in the United States, we have Elon Musk running Twitter and Mark Zuckerberg running Facebook. You can see how perhaps oligarchs, or in this case, billionaires, they're the same thing, running our public forums or public whatever, what kind of effect it could have. So Roman Abramovich, all these people were in fact oligarchs, and Putin, when he took over, had to clean a lot of this up. In 2000, I think it was 1996, Time magazine published a very interesting article, Yanks to the Rescue. This was literally Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, waving a United States flag. Interesting. The secret story of how American advisors helped Yeltsin win. Yeltsin had a 6% approval rating at the time, somehow won the election. There's an interesting movie called Spinning Boris, if you ever want to see it. It was produced based on these stories that were coming out. The United States wasn't even hiding it. Forget about election interference or hacking the election. This is literally like hacking the election, right? Based on a true story, right? With Jeff Goldblum, and you got these advisors. Ooh, they're naked, huh? And then basically helping this guy. They're helping Yeltsin win. And this is a story. So they literally made a movie out of this. What exactly happened? Well, here's what happened. There's a constitutional crisis where President Yeltsin intended to dissolve the entire parliament. Okay? So you got the parliament versus the president. Where did we see that? We got Duma. We got the Verkhovna Rada against Yanukovych. Here we had this. In this case, the president won because the United States
was in the middle of a
because the United States was supporting these economic reforms.
Constitutional crisis when the president, Boris Yeltsin, ordered the army to shell Moscow's White House, the building housing parliament, on October 4th,
Pretty insane, ain't it?
1993.
But this conflict was resolved and did not lead to World War III. But here's what you got here.
At the instigation of defiant lawmakers, Moscow had just witnessed the deadliest street fighting since the revolution of
Oh, look at that guy. How old is that guy?
1917. In the end, the immediate crisis was resolved with the use of military force.
Why was it resolved? Because one side had the guns, or it was more powerful. Things tend to be solved, and you can see that once I get into the Ukraine conflict. The second half is like in Kharkiv, when rebellions are put down, in Catalonia, right, put down, arrested, done. In some ways, that's better than having millions of people in an ever-escalating conflict and having outside sponsorship by large world powers. Here, it was nipped in the bud, and so Yeltsin prevailed like this.
After the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, Russian President Boris Yeltsin launched a set of radical economic reforms aimed at dismantling the command economy and swiftly creating free market conditions. The parliament, the Supreme Soviet, opposed the quick transformation of the economy. Tensions also grew over the balance of power between the legislative and executive branches. The disagreements escalated on September 21st, 1993, when Yeltsin decided to dissolve parliament and call new elections, saying it was necessary to overcome the state crisis.
A crisis that another country, the United States, helped to bring about because of its historic opposition to any command economy like communism. However, you could say that the U.S. Army is one of the largest command economies in the world and is subsidized by U.S. taxpayer dollars. And by the way, cannot account for those dollars. So we got, what is it now? $35 trillion accounting black hole, says Yahoo. That was 2 years ago. And we keep increasing their budget. Speaking of command economies, do countries need this kind of unaccountable, literally cannot account for their, I don't know, probably a lot of black ops in here that they can't tell you about. But surely there's a lot of waste too. Anyway, I digress. So Yeltsin was able to win.
Russia was in the middle of a constitutional crisis.
The Russian people did not get a good taste of United States ideas for their country, but also did not feel like the United States is really treating them like they used to when they feared or respected USSR, like we saw here. Okay, this was a completely different country, weaker, more disoriented and lost, and that is when Yeltsin, who became more and more drunk and inebriated, handed over unilaterally the presidentship to Vladimir Putin. Who was Putin? Putin was essentially an ex-KGB spy who worked for KGB, similar to that, like how people work for the CIA, like Snowden. And then he went to live in St. Petersburg, back then called Leningrad, and basically just, had a family, and he was this guy. And he rose through the ranks of this new group called the FSB after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then he rose through the ranks until eventually he was seen by Yeltsin as someone who could actually take over and unify the country. So
between police and anti-Yeltsin protesters erupted. After the demonstrators attacked a local television studio and the mayor's office, Yeltsin declared a state of emergency in the capital. The conflict came to a head on October 4th, 1993, when Yeltsin ordered the army to take up positions around the White House. Electricity, water, and telephones were cut off. Yeltsin ordered a military assault. Tanks shelled the building. It took just a few hours before soldiers managed to arrest the leaders of the resistance.
The resistance being the actual parliament.
Crisis that had brought the country to the brink of civil war had been diffused.
So this is a good outcome because it's been diffused. There was a very interesting article a few years ago. I think it was Taibbi. I forgot who it was exactly. How Russia views Putin. This is very important to understand. unlike the United States, Putin's been around for a very long time. Unlike U.S. presidents, you could think of as like how the United States viewed Franklin Delano Roosevelt, perhaps, because he was a very long-term president as well. Yeah, you could go ahead and look at all these different things, and again, you would find that the country's opinion of their presidents is typically a lot better of their presidents than other countries, like George W. Bush, Donald Trump. Had a lot more support in their own country, and other countries just could not understand it. Similarly, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, you have to start understanding it's the entire country. So support for Ukraine war within the United States. Why most Russians continue to support the war it hasn't wavered. We're talking about when was this article? If you look at 83%, that was as high as 83%. It has wavered. It's dropped. I think it's something like 67%. But if you look at the U.S. support for the war in Iraq, it's very similar. U.S. support for war in Iraq. We knew what happened. We still reelected the guy. 2004. U.S. support for Iraq war. Where is it? All right, fine. So we see around 2003, it's very high support and on the invasion of Iraq. But then even afterwards, we had a ton of support. According to Gallup poll, support for the war is up to 72%. And out of those 72%, 59% supported the war strongly. Afterwards, you're going to get 54% supporting the war. Eventually, there's a shift in public support for the war. But Americans overwhelmingly approve of President Bush and his decisions in Iraq during the major combat phase of the war. And then afterwards, there was the occupation. This is the occupation of Iraq was the most deadly part. So you have to understand this is not a war that just one madman Putin is waging, or one madman George W. Bush who called it a crusade for a hot moment. Okay? This is a war. This is something that's supported by the publics and the media, okay, of the country. You have to start understanding that they are us, right? If you were there and you grew up there, then you would be subjected to that media. And so if you live in an imperialist country, United States, Russia, China, and so on, you're going to have this exceptionalism, this idea that you've got your manifest destiny, you've got this thing, even going back, Monroe Doctrine. 1823, the entire Western Hemisphere is claimed as a protectorate by the United States, essentially. It's kind of, wow. So imagine if in this kind of environment, Europe decides to welcome Mexico, who has historical grievances, as we've seen. Land was taken from them. Imagine if they welcomed a neighbor of the United States into an alliance, a military alliance, and then put nukes on that country, right? Maybe not now. Maybe they'll put nukes in the future. But the United States is not going to wait around for this, right? They don't want to do it. And so this is what they basically said. Blockade. I'm going to see it over here. So blockade. Ultimatum to Khrushchev. Move those missiles. Or what, you might ask. And that's the question, isn't it? Or what? Well, the United States had, a year before, invaded Cuba. The Bay of Pigs invasion, you could say, was not an invasion by the United States itself, but they certainly equipped a bunch of Cuban exiles to go ahead and try to invade Cuba. That was April 17th, 1961. The following year, Cuba said to USSR, please defend us. And USSR said, okay. What was not very well known at the time, but declassified later, is that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States had already put that very same thing. They had put nuclear missiles in Turkey. Publicized removal of the Soviet Union's nuclear missiles from Cuba. This is what everyone knew. Non-publicized removal of American nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. Whoa, I didn't know about Italy even. Agreement with the Soviet Union and the United States would never invade Cuba without direct provocation. So check this out. First of all, who put nuclear missiles on the doorstep of another country? Back then they didn't have very good ICBMs, etc. Who did it first? But no, when the Soviets did it, we said, okay, this is bad. We should stop. But this is my point. The pot calling the kettle black. How about not doing it in the first place? But what's beautiful is that the leaders actually listened to each other, and the olive branch that President Kennedy put out was what motivated Khrushchev to actually come and meet him halfway. And this started a very, very positive drawdown of weapons, normalization of relations. It's all because of the listening to the other side. And even though they had more differences than they had today, it was something that was their mutual interest. All they needed was a mutual understanding and something that they could speak a language that the other could appreciate. And it sounded like this, right?
To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is.
I wish people today would go back and listen to this, because today we are obsessed with blame. If the whole world gets nuked, at least we could blame Putin. And it's like, well, it's not just Putin, it's the entire Russian public. Or I shouldn't say entire, but it's the majority of the Russian public supports the war. Why do they support the war? Now that is the right question. And it's something that we need to understand before we can simply dismiss it as George W. Bush said, the action of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and unprovoked invasion of Iraq. Oops, I'm sorry, I mean Ukraine.
And not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war.
When asked, how will this war end? Everyone says, well, Russia must completely remove all its troops, give back all the land which they occupied, and then pay reparations, and maybe even change its president, and etc. Yeah, I mean, cool, that's plan A, and I would, for one, be very happy if that would avert nuclear war. And in general, it seems like a cool thing, because then you get territorial integrity of Ukraine. But what is plan B? What if, since when did ever Russia or China or United States or Turkey or any country voluntarily do that? I mean, the closest maybe would be Obama and what the Republicans call the apology tour. Obama did, in fact, withdraw troops from Iraq. But subsequent presidents did not. So, for example, when there was a unanimous, this year, I think, or last year, unanimous vote, Iraq withdraw troops. Here's what happened. Iraqi parliament votes to expel U.S. troops, 2 years ago. What was Trump's response? Sanctions. Sanctions on Iraq. They need to take their oil. Basically, they unanimously voted. Here. Unanimous vote by Shia parties. Okay, maybe the Sunnis were. Anyways, we don't care, right? We're not going to leave. Even the stated goals of Osama bin Laden, one of the grievances was that we maintain permanent bases, I think, in Saudi Arabia, and so on. I mean, the thing is, expecting Putin to just leave, and again, it's not just Putin, we have to think of it in terms of the public of Russia, right? And their self-conception of their history. They believe that they and Ukraine have a shared history. That's partially true for these people in Ukraine, not so much for these people in Ukraine. And the people of Ukraine rightly say that Kievan Rus, the Kiev Rus was started around Kiev, and only later that these guys, the Muscovites, the Duchess of Muscovy, become primary and take over. So these are two competing narratives, and again, that's not surprising. Israelis and Palestinians have competing narratives, and all this talk about, that state is not a real state on both sides. This is a common thing. So, the delegitimizing of the other. But let's go through actually what happened next. So what happened next, and I've said it's very similar with Brzezinski.
Because your fight will prevail, and you'll have your homes.
And
the destiny you seek lies in Europe.
Anyway, so they're all agitating them to leave Russia and so on. So then what happens is, let's look at what happened in the aftermath of that. We've gone through this. Newsnight, the BBC, again, mainstream sources. Back then, the BBC was openly highlighting who was involved and armed in this armed uprising in Ukraine. Take a listen.
Groups of armed men strut through the square with dubious iconography. That yellow armband is a Volksangel, a German symbol used by several SS divisions during the...
Remember that Volksangel? That's what we saw in Technibock's initial National Socialist Party.
Second World War. Far-right graffiti is appearing, daubed on the walls of the city. The people...
This is the kind of stuff that if you bring it up now, you're going to be called a Putin apologist or a Russian asset. But is the BBC a Russian asset? This is the state media of Great Britain, of the UK. It's a British broadcast service. And I'm going to show you in the United States, like, very mainstream things, because back then it was okay to show what was really happening. And I think it's important to highlight this, to show the history month by month of how this developed.
Who brought down the government were overwhelmingly ordinary Ukrainians, students and doctors, workers and even families, people who simply refused to back down. But the most organized and perhaps the most effective were a small number of far-right groups. When it came to confrontations with the police, it was often the nationalists who were the loudest and the most violent. A group calling itself the Right Sector is perhaps the largest. Its members can be seen marching around Kiev in columns of about a dozen. Mostly they carry baseball bats. Sometimes they carry guns. We met these men posing for pictures outside the burnt-out remains of what was...
The Right Sector. The Right Sector, after the Svoboda Party had its success in 2012, and you'll see them again in these videos, the Right Sector, again, they were not the majority of Ukrainians. I would not, there's about 10,000 people in the Right Sector total. It was run by a different guy, Dmitry Yarosh, I believe. Dmitro Yarosh. And so, it had 500 fighters in Independence Square, could mobilize up to 5,000 nationwide. There was at some point about 10,000 people in it. But again, the idea being that, there's a small number of people, but they're the more active ones. The majority of Ukrainians, just like in any country, would like to sit at home and sit this one out. They don't want any part of this. And again, that's because civilians simply want to leave. If the picture that strikes me the most about this, and again, this was during this year's invasion, is Ukrainians waiting for the train to escape the refugees, right? I don't know if there's these images of people just waiting, right? These are the civilians who are trying to leave. And, there was some stories about racism also, that some people could leave before others. But these civilians, this is who I care about the most. And here I'm revealing, whose side I'm on. I'm on the side of unarmed, regular people. Maybe armed with, like, a very light gun or something like this. But certainly no one who decides to take their family to the front in order to defend some sort of geopolitical thing. So let's just go ahead, and continue.
Was once their headquarters. I asked them about their political beliefs.
Национал-социалистская тематика иногда в некоторых людях она есть проступает. Чтобы была единая нация.
Oops, I'm sorry. Pressed the wrong button there. There we go. Okay.
В некоторых людях она есть проступает. Чтобы была единая нация. Но не у всех, это не заложено в основе этой организации, это у некоторых людей есть.
А у вас?
У меня лично есть.
В смысле, объясните.
Мне нравится эта идея единой нации. Я хочу, чтобы нация была единая, чтобы один народ, одна страна, одна нация.
А это подразумевается что?
Чтобы чистая нация. Не то, что там, у Гитлера как было. В своем роде немножко, маленько, но было, чтобы своя нация.
Some people want to have their own nation, but these are definitely kind of right-wing nationalist ideas. And again, this is not something that the word nationalist does not necessarily right away mean Nazi. You could see one of my other videos that I made about this in the past, Nationalism versus Socialism, the Power of Words. And you could see Donald Trump calling himself a nationalist. And a lot of other nationalists around the world, not necessarily,
Okay, so... Because it will be better for you? Oh, come on. I mean, they could say the same thing, right?
So here's
on this Oprah show, where he was talking about how our country is being run by...
So, nationalist. This is an idea of nationalist. Again, there's all kinds of nationalists. You could have people who are talking about immigrants coming to the country.
Reaction to globalists, sort of
They don't want globalists, like
taking away the
Alex Jones, and you got all kinds of different nationalists. But the idea is that Donald Trump calls himself a nationalist, and it's not necessarily something that makes you think he's a Nazi, necessarily. A lot of people on the right, he says all kinds of stuff. But
and I told all of the European nations it's not fair. We have all these horrible trade imbalances. They take such advantage, they're not taking advantage anymore. America first.
America first.
In a lot of decades, we're putting...
There you go.
Democrats want to turn back globalists, right? You know what a globalist is? A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that. You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay?
And everyone cheers. So the nationalism, let's be charitable here and say that the nationalism that they're talking about is that kind of nationalism. But then they go on.
What about the East, I asked? What about Crimea, where many Ukrainians feel close historical ties to Russia?
Кому нравится Россия, пусть едут в Россию. Украина только для украинцев.
Whoever wants to go to Russia, let them go to... Whoever likes Russia, let them go back to Russia. Ukraine is just for Ukrainians. You could see Britain first. You could see a lot of nationalism in Russia. Russia has its own neo-Nazi problem. You could Google for it. So it's not just the Ukraine. Here, actually, I'll show you. Russia's neo-Nazi problem. Skinheads, people whose grandfathers fought the Nazis. Russia has a long history of neo-Nazis. So Putin wants to denazify Ukraine. Well, if he wanted to denazify something, he can start right there at home. I'm not going to talk about this right now. But just by sheer numbers, I think there's probably more nationalists in Russia. Keep in mind, these guys are young. Look how young they are. And that's going to be a very important contrast with what I'm about to show you. But I do want to show you one other nationalist, one other group right here.
Police have largely disappeared from the streets of Kiev. Law and order is maintained by so-called self-defense groups. Not all hold extreme views, but those who do are often shy of the cameras. We got a late-night phone call from another group known as C14, inviting us to meet their leader at their new base. It turned out to be the former headquarters of the Communist Party, now occupied by the far right.
This is C13. I don't know what their whole thing is, MS-13, C13. Anyway, this is what they have to say.
Because we don't know. It's our general mission to
C14.
totally ruin chains that connect our country with imperial power from the past.
And that being Russia?
Yes, we can tell Russia, not only Russia, Soviet Union.
Are you a Nazi?
No, I don't think I'm a Nazi, I'm a Ukrainian nationalist.
What does that mean?
The main confrontation is about that some ethnic groups have control many business structures, some economic, some political forces, and
which ethnic groups?
Russians and Jews and the Poles. It may be every.
Sounds a little bit like Kanye West over here.
Some non-Ukrainian group control a huge percent of some economic or political...
This is the thing. If you look at my video of nationalists versus socialists, you will find that when there is control and there's unrest and bad economic prospects, socialists will tend to blame the oligarchs, the business magnates, the corporations. In other words, horizontally divide society by class. The nationalists will blame the immigrants and the Jews and the people who are the foreign interests controlling the country. So these are the kind of attitudes. Again, it could be inbuilt in people, how they vertically, divide people by nationality, religion, whatever, or how they horizontally divide and what their solutions are. But as you could tell, most nationalists are anti-communist and most communists are anti-nationalist. And so it's funny they're using the communist former headquarters.
And of course, in this situation, Ukrainian people have some tension between it, and it causes conflicts.
Mr. Karas.
That's an understatement. If you only knew what would happen in the next few years.
Says his group consists of around 200 men. C14 is affiliated with a political party.
By the way, keep in mind, 200 men or 5,000 men in a country of 40 million people. Okay, so the amount of Nazis or whatever you want to call it, nationalists, here is minuscule. But much is made of these groups on Russian media, which I'm going to show next.
Called Svoboda, or Freedom, which now controls 4 ministries in the new government, including the Ministry of Defense.
Now that's important. So in Russia, yes, they do have neo-Nazis, but at least they are not elected to government. There was a brief period around 2014 when I want to say Nazis, nationalists were elected to the government, but they had since been moderated. If you look at Sweden right now, the party is winning right now in Sweden. A nationalist came to power. Look at Italy. You've got someone who is here we go. The Sweden Democrats, a nationalist party with fascist roots. Okay, so does that mean that Russia has to invade to denazify Sweden? I mean, this is ridiculous. Just give people, the key is to make sure that these ideas don't spill over into actual violent conflict. Again, Ukraine was a democratic country. So normally when McCain or someone comes and says stuff like this,
Ukraine will make Europe better, and Europe will make Ukraine better.
Right. Normally this is a get out the vote thing, and then you have to vote peacefully against this other group that votes for Yanukovych, let's say Party of Regions. And then together you would vote and vote in whatever thing. Just like here we have abortion, pro-abortion, anti-abortion, right? You vote. Well, somehow, instead of voting, there was essentially a revolution. And the elements that were highlighted by the BBC and by, again, when I showed you BBC right sector, that was also the BBC. If you look at 2018, you see things like, this is later, I'm jumping ahead, I just want to show, rights groups demand that Israel stop arming neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Again, who is writing this? Haaretz, a left-wing newspaper in Israel, talking about human rights activists petition the court to cease Israeli arms exports to Ukraine. What a stark difference between the reporting back then, this is 2018 we're talking about, and what we have now. Human rights activists and so on. Anyway, let's see the aftermath of this uprising. So what happened in this uprising was, and this is, I guess, important to understand, is that during the Revolution of Dignity, the uprising resulted in a bunch of protesters clashing with police. See, Yanukovych's crackdown on the protests backfired badly. We don't know just how much support they had from perhaps the CIA or whatever, perhaps they did not. But certainly the revolution, similar to what we see in Iran right now, what we saw in Belarus, what we saw in Kazakhstan, or just earlier this year, Kazakhstan revolution or whatever, uprising, unrest, okay? Literally mass protests. This kind of stuff, who knows? I don't know what, this is the kind of stuff that happens. It's not like it's unprecedented. Iran, uprising. I don't know what exactly is going on there, but it's interesting. I don't know if it's completely grassroots or if there's some astroturfing, but we do know that in 1953, there was an astroturfed revolution against, well, here we go. Okay, there was a revolution to take down Mohammad Mossadegh. The idea is that, and strengthen the monarchical rule of the Shah, who, resulted in a bunch of prosperity and peace for a while. But Mossadegh, all he wanted to do was nationalize the oil. And my point simply is that we don't know if these revolutions are completely, totally pure and pristine by the people or whatever. And similarly, the other way, we're going to see now, the uprisings in the east of Ukraine, how much did Russia have a hand in fomenting those revolutions? You can see here, Frontline PBS, this is what goes on. So just the cliff notes on what happened. 20,000 Euromaidan protesters advanced on the Ukrainian parliament in support of restoring the constitution of Ukraine to its 2004 form. How much does this sound like January 6th, where they go to the Congress and the Congress building in support of making America great again? I'm just saying, if one is considered to be unacceptable in democratic society or dangerous, then this certainly shows you what it could lead to. So, again, Yanukovych was elected president in 2010. This is perhaps a reasonable demand to restore the constitution to 2004 form. However, the police fired guns with rubber bullets and later live ammunition in an attempt to repel thousands of demonstrators. The protesters fought with crude weapons, but later came with firearms and Molotov cocktails, broke into the headquarters of the Party of Regions. Okay? Police officers stormed the main protest camp, overran parts of the square. This is a full-on thing. We've seen this, like I was showing before in 2003. They dispersed the protesters in Russia. It could have become a civil war there. So as you can imagine, some protesters were against Yanukovych, others were for. I'll get to that in a second, the anti-Maidan protest. But my point simply is that the people representing them, including Vladimir Klitschko, but also the right sector and others, they refused any sort of compromise with the government. The Yanukovych government offered concessions. They said it was too little, too late. That's kind of, unfortunately, the story of this whole conflict. So to breeze through what happened next is that essentially Yanukovych had to run. He ran to Russia, which was seen very badly. The president of Ukraine running to Russia. Similarly, we saw, before I showed you Yanks to the Rescue, this idea of a president of one country waving the flag of another country, seen as a traitor. Didn't help that Yanukovych's palatial residence was raided, and they discovered how much of a kleptocrat he was as well. Anyway, after that, the Verkhovna Rada, the Parliament of Ukraine, elected transitional government, and later held accelerated elections where they elected Poroshenko. All in all, democracy had been restored, but the question is, what was the result in the meantime? Poroshenko was elected in 2015, I believe. So in the meantime, what was happening? So Poroshenko, no, 2014, there was elections, presidency, okay. May 2014. So that was fairly quick. And so democracy in Ukraine was restored. But when democracy is shaken by some people say a coup, some people say whatever, it's called a revolution. This is what Nigel Farage was talking about happened next. And now I'll show you what the result on the ground was, but I just wanted to play for you the words of Nigel Farage in the EU.
Amongst the long list of foreign policy failures,
chastising them as he often did, and talking about what the result would be of this thing. This is what he said in 2014.
Contradictions in the last few years, including, of course, the bombing of Libya, the desire to arm the rebels in Syria, has been the unnecessary provocation of Vladimir Putin. This EU empire, ever seeking to expand, stated its territorial claim on the Ukraine some years ago. Just to make that worse, of course,
It's interesting. I feel that whoever is not exactly supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity or independence, on the other hand, right, the people the other way, say the Ukraine for whatever reason. And in Russia, too, it's like on Ukraine. Like if you say that, it's kind of almost like a shibboleth of like, oh, you don't support Ukraine. I don't know. But anyway, this is what he was saying. And there's a lot of truth to it. Hear him out.
Of Vladimir Putin. This EU empire, ever seeking to expand, stated its territorial claim on the Ukraine some years ago. Just to make that worse, of course, some NATO members said they too would like the Ukraine to join NATO. We directly encouraged the uprising in the Ukraine that led to the toppling of the president, Yanukovych, and that...
Some people disagreed with that. But of course, you could see, and this is the only video I'm using here, but you could also look at, for example, the Victoria Nuland phone call about how they were involved in selecting the next leader of Ukraine. But this is directly encouraging, I suppose. Anyway, let's continue.
That led, of course, in turn to Vladimir Putin reacting. And the moral of the story is if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when he reacts. Now, just to continue with that, today we are rushing through an association agreement at undue speed with the Ukraine, and as we speak, there are NATO soldiers engaged in military exercises in the Ukraine. Have we taken leave of our senses? Do we actually want to have a war with Putin? Because if we do, we're certainly going about it the right way. Perhaps
he was saying this in 2014. Are we going to have a war with Putin? Everyone says Putin, Putin, Putin. It's a country, Russia. Yes, they have a leader which they keep electing, but don't forget, Medvedev was the president when Russia was doing similar things with Georgia. And that's an important point. And that's actually explaining the motivation for Russia in Ukraine. Before I get there, let's finish here.
We ought to recognize that the West now faces the biggest threat and crisis to our way of life that we have seen for over 70 years. The recent beheadings of the British and American hostages graphically illustrates the problem. And of course we have our own citizens from our own countries engaged in that struggle too. In the war against Islamic extremism, Vladimir Putin, whatever we may think of him as a human being, is actually on our side. I suggest we grow up. I suggest we recognise the real threat facing all of our countries, communities and societies. We stop playing war games in the Ukraine and we start to prepare a plan to help countries like Syria, like Iraq, like Kenya, like indeed Nigeria, to try and help them to deal with the real threat that faces us.
So he's talking about helping countries repel invasions by Islamic terrorists and people who want to build an Islamic caliphate. And Boko Haram in Nigeria, for example, back then it was, a lot of the Yazidis were being slaughtered by ISIS and so on. So these are very useful things. And he says,
Let's not go on provoking Putin, whether we like him or not.
Well, anyways, so the idea, again, back there is Nigel Farage was saying why to do this. And if you remember, I was pointing out that Hillary Clinton wanted a no-fly zone over Syria. Again, sort of this insane brinksmanship of why would you do that when you could just join forces to pummel ISIS, right? So this is the idea. And the revolution that took place here, this was the result in the east of Ukraine. Now we're going to turn our attention to Russian meddling. We've mentioned U.S. meddling. Now we talk about Russian meddling in the east of Ukraine. Russia, of course, trying to hold on to its influence in its neighborhood region of the world. But previously, it was, in fact, controlling it. It was dominant, right, in the USSR. This is what people felt here. And contrast the shall we say, the ages of these people, okay, with the people you're going to see here. So let's go.
I noticed Dmytro's scarf displayed the face of an infamous Ukrainian nationalist, Stepan Bandera. During the Second World War, Bandera initially sided with the Nazis when they attacked the Soviet Union. He hoped they'd give Ukraine its independence. But when the Nazis didn't give him what he wanted, Bandera's forces fought both the Nazis and the Soviets.
Bandera is a polarizing figure in Ukraine. The statues to Bandera were similar to statues of, let's say, Confederate statues in the United States, also seen as glorifying local heroes who tried to separate from a hegemon, in this case, the Union, the North, right? Similarly, Ukraine, remember, is trying to separate from Soviets and so on. But, and they remember the Holodomor, which I spoke about. So Bandera was a national hero for people in the west of Ukraine, while at the same time considered a Nazi collaborator by the Russians. Having spent most of the war in a Nazi prison, he himself did not personally kill anyone, but his organization, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN, Ukraine, did kill a bunch of people. Most notably, they killed Polish nationals in some massacres. Remember that Ukraine also did not have a great history with Poland, when Poland was the big powerhouse. If you go back here, Poland, Lithuania. Okay, I don't know. So, point being that there's all these ethnic conflicts and local heroes where other countries consider them to be, well, terrorists. Or worse, Nazi collaborators. You see similar things where the PKK, for example, is considered to be terrorists by Turkey. And they have their national heroes. Here is or Arafat is a national hero for Palestinians, for example, despite many, many conflicts, including Black September and other things. So here is what Russian media portrays to its domestic audience.
В годы Великой Отечественной целая дивизия из украинских добровольцев этих мест, она так и называлась, СС Галичина, воевала на стороне Третьего рейха.
Russian TV only highlighted the Ukrainian nationalist Nazi past.
Сегодня парни из того же региона тоже против России. Все входят в так называемый правый сектор, что взял на себя ответственность за огненную и кровавую битву с полицией.
They're talking about the right sector, which at the time took responsibility for the fiery and bloody battle with the police in Kiev, says the Russian media. What they don't say is that Putin encouraged Yanukovych to crack down on the protesters and in fact led to the very backlash that he received.
Right Sector was one of the groups that led the fight against President Yanukovych's forces on the day of the shootings. In the square, I met one of a new generation of Ukrainians, attracted to Right Sector's fervent nationalism and hatred of Russia, 17-year-old Oleg Demchuk.
I'm studying computer science in Kiev.
This guy is like the quintessential. He's like a programmer, but look, he's also like he's young and he grew up after 1991. And like, that's what I'm trying to say is completely different from what happened during this, right? Transfer of Crimea in the Soviet Union. See the exact, like here, people don't feel like they feel like they're part of the Russian Empire or they feel like they're part of the USSR, just like you would feel like a part of the EU or whatever. It's not, or the USA, there's no national pride for these republics like you have here now.
I want to be a computer programmer. We're all like that here.
Oleg had been involved in some of the most intense fights.
There's a bunch of burning tires back then.
That day in the square.
So let's fast forward to the aftermath, the anti-Maidan revolution. First of all, it's tough to compare modern presidents to Hitler because there's so much comparisons to Hitler, right? Everyone's trying to compare Trump to Hitler or Biden to Hitler. Putin, a lot of people are comparing to Hitler. Look, when you watch Hitler's speeches, okay, Hitler speech, any speech, it would look something like this. The Reichstag, any one of these speeches.
Meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin.
Okay, the guy is so animated, so passionate, and so angry. And he's trying, and so this is what, Hitler's speeches. And so we must do this, we must do that. You look at Mussolini, it's a little bit less than that. But then these presidents, they try to be like careful, measured, like trying to say what they think. And that's why I think it's important for them to listen to each other rather than calling each other Nazis or Hitler. And that also means they have to listen to the Ukrainian president or the Belarusian president. And look, they may be lying or they may be blowhards or they may be this or that. But there's a certain... They're not Hitler. They can, in fact, get together. The main problem of today is that we don't know what was said behind closed doors. We don't know what, we don't know whether NATO promised the not 1 inch thing. Although now that we get more and more archives, right? National Security Archive, we find that declassified documents show security assurances against NATO expansion to Soviet leaders from Baker, Bush, Genscher, Kohl, Cates, Thatcher. In other words, who promised what to whom? We actually see security assurances were given, and they were given on paper. And we're talking about declassified documents. So the whole not an inch thing, Gorbachev doesn't seem to remember. Let's say it was given, that promise. Let's say it was, but it wasn't documented in some sort of treaty. And sometimes even the treaties are not respected. For example, the agreed framework by Clinton with Kim Jong-il. The treaty was, we will take down sanctions, step-by-step normalization of relations, and they will freeze and replace their indigenous nuclear power program with basically light water. They basically will stop their nuclear program. Well, the Bush administration scuttled this agreed framework, let it die, called it appeasement. And of course, the Koreans didn't do much better. It died on the vine and they got a nuke. Not only did they get a nuke, but they also proliferated the nuke to Syria, which is called Operation Orchard, if you see, by Israel to bomb reactors. At the time, people didn't know if it was a nuclear reactor. Later, they found out basically it was a nuclear facility with a military purpose. We don't know about the military purpose part, but in 2009, during Civil War, the Syrian Civil War later, during the Syrian Civil War, IAEA, International Atomic Agency, officially confirmed the site was a nuclear reactor. Point being that not only did North Korea develop nukes, but they proliferated that technology to others. Iran now, Iran deal. If you know, the Iran deal is something that essentially Tom Cotton and all these Republicans, I think who was it? Iran deal. He wrote this thing saying, "Don't trust the United States." Maybe it's not Cotton. Iran deal, open letter. So for the first time ever, the U.S. congressman openly said, "Do not trust our administration because we're going to change our mind." The minute our parties change. In other words, if the treaty is not binding enough, if it doesn't have ratification from Congress and so on, U.S. military leaders, interesting. I was talking about open letter. Open letter from Congress to the Republic of Iran, basically saying that here we go. GOP senators send letter to Iran in attempt to undermine nuclear deal. This is recent again. No, this is 2015. So they go ahead and warn the leaders of Iran that any nuclear deal they cut with President Obama could expire the day he leaves office, kind of undercutting his thing. And these days, U.S. not going to waste time on Iran deal right now. This is not going to be revived again because you need Russia to bring Iran to the table. They need to participate. How are they going to participate? How is anyone going to participate in this kind of environment? Instead, Iran is giving drones to Russia, or they deny it. They say Russia's building them themselves. Who knows? The point is that they have each other's back now. So Iran can't be invaded so easily or at all because Russia will probably defend it. And Russia has nuclear weapons already. It can help them develop their own. Just like someone helped North Korea develop their own. So anyway, this is where things led.
В некоторых частях Украины и в том числе в Киеве.
I set out from Kiev towards eastern Ukraine, where Putin's words hold sway and where many people think of themselves as more Russian than Ukrainian. Many of them were angered by the overthrow of President Yanukovych and alarmed by the rise of right sector.
Now again, as you watch this, try to figure out how much Russian influence there was in creating these anti-Maidan revolutions. What I'm about to show you is just how many people came out to support sort of the Yanukovych government and fearful of this takeover by these elements, the nationalist elements, these young guys of the essentially the Ukrainian government.
Headed to Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, just 25 miles from the Russian border. I found a city in turmoil, with violence between groups supporting the new national government and those who wanted to break away and become part of Russia.
Wanted to break away and become part of Russia. These are police. Again, these are trying to keep the peace. A similar situation is developing in the east of Ukraine, but politically is diametrically the opposite. How I've shown you the separatists in Crimea. Sorry, Crimea is a separate thing. As I've shown you the separatists in Catalonia, as well as the Kurds and others, people do want to separate if they feel, especially like they're not being represented. These people are afraid that their way of life will be cracked down upon by people who don't like the Russian language. People have said, if, he says...
А это подразумевается что? Что...
Маленько, но было, чтобы своя нация. То, что там, как бы у Гитлера, как было, в своем роде немножко, маленько, но было, чтобы своя нация.
What about the East, I asked? What about Crimea, where many Ukrainians feel close historical ties to Russia?
Кому нравится Россия, пусть едут в Россию. Украина будет только для украинцев.
Notice he's speaking Russian. He's not speaking Ukrainian. In fact, I would say most foreign journalists who visit Ukraine, they either could speak Russian or they don't speak any Ukrainian. In other words, they don't learn Ukrainian because it's a regional language. Ukrainian, in some ways, may be closer to Polish than Russian. And so you could see that in the streets of Kiev, people are speaking Russian here. When he says Ukraine will be just for Ukrainians, many people are still using the Russian language, even though they are nationalists. They don't necessarily, but I don't know if his kids will be speaking Russian anymore, especially given what's going on now. Here, on the other hand, is what these people who have come out in the thousands in all these cities, Kharkiv, Odessa, you'll see also Donetsk and Lugansk, which people have come down to do protests there. You'll see how much of this is it astroturfed? Is Russia supporting some of it? I would say yes to both. But here you can see the old people coming out. They're certainly not being astroturfed. Here you go.
Right sector's anti-Russian sentiment was mirrored here by a hatred of America and yearning for the old Soviet Union. Many were worried the new government in Kiev would persecute Russian speakers in the east.
Я Путину вот клянусь и на колени стану и попрошу, чтобы только Харьков не тронули. Пускай не лезут фашисты сюда. Вот, дай Бог ему здоровья. Пусть Путина защитит, Россия нас защитит.
Во Второй мировой войне Англия и Америка были наши союзники. Почему теперь в борьбе с фашизмом, а теперь Англия и Америка поддерживают профашистский режим, который у нас теперь насаждается? Вот так.
It's interesting how much these people are afraid. They're obviously locals. They're obviously looking at this group and hearing on the news, because they're not there. They don't know the prevalence, but they certainly see again, this is a BBC showing it. So between these two videos, you could see what is essentially some neo-Nazi elements, or you could say nationalist elements.
Destroyed the Ukrainian nation in the 20th century and fought against Ukrainians and killed millions of Ukrainians.
The fervor of the revolution is beginning to fade.
Okay, they remember the grievances with the Stalin and the Soviet Union. These people want to often even a return to the Soviet Union, especially the older generation. It's a big difference between the young and the old, people who grew up after 1991 in a more liberated Ukraine, which is again, national project, right? As opposed to simply a republic or a province. Like imagine a province in Canada wanting to secede, like Quebec. They still don't necessarily feel like they don't feel this huge national pride they're going to kill people over. But here it's already been inculcated in the young people, right? In essentially the nationalist movement.
Kharkiv, I discovered Right Sector's biggest opponent, a militant group called Stronghold. Many of its members want parts of Ukraine to break away and join Russia. They're known as tough street fighters, and I was told that some have links.
Look at this. Oh, look at this lady. She's participating with
to organized crime. I tracked down one of Stronghold's leaders, who used the cover name Igor, and only agreed to talk to me if I concealed his identity.
The nationalists took over the country illegally and began to oppress us. We organized our own militia and we attacked the Kharkiv government building on the 1st of March.
So these guys also took over a building. Now, what's interesting is that the Ukrainian government swiftly put down these protesters and the occupiers of these buildings. And just like in Catalonia, the whole thing was done. And Kharkiv today, until 2021, was prospering.
I got hold of this footage showing Igor and his fellow separatists storming the government building, where Ukrainian nationalists opposed to Russia had been holed up.
Ukrainian nationalists were holed up in this building. Now, if you look at Odessa, okay, anti-Maidan in Odessa, here you go. This is Odessa against takeover by, look how many people came out there. Odessa was historically never really fit into Ukraine completely. It was sort of an independent port city, considered itself important, kind of like New York City, you know, in the United States. Kind of like, it's the Quebec of Ukraine. Here we go. This is the anti-Maidan protest. These are people who are essentially not happy with the takeover. They're yelling Odessa is a hero city. Notice how they're having pride in their city. And they don't want it necessarily to be, they said we fought against the Nazis and look what's probably going on. That's one interpretation of what they're saying here. These people are proud of their grandfathers fighting the Second World War, a war where the USSR lost 30 million people to the Third Reich and their armies. And so there's a lot of pride mixed in, trying to say that we don't want a resurgence of this taking over our government. So this is what they... And it just goes on, basically. Again, these demonstrators are examples of anti-Maidan protests. And then what happened was that these protests were put down in Kharkiv, in Odessa, but one specific incident, Odessa fire, that happened during the protest, a fire broke out. And during these clashes, people burned alive in this building. It's not clear that anyone actually wanted this to happen, but that's what happened. You could read about detailed minute-by-minute timeline of events, the investigation. You see videos of even the Maidan protesters, trying to pull them out. But I've personally seen in 2014, buses of Maidan and anti-Maidan protests, being attacked. Those people being attacked here or there. It was a full-on sort of clash, similar to what you saw in 1993 coup in constitutional crisis in Russia. If you want to read more, you could go to anti-Maidan protests. There's a whole article about that in Wikipedia. So you could see all the different protests. There's even anti-Maidan protests in Kiev itself. That's a lot of people that come out, and they have Ukrainian flags. They're saying we don't want the Maidan protest. And that happens all over the place. That happens in countries like, for example, you got Czech Republic. Czech just the other day. Okay, first you got Czechs rally against. Czechs rally against rising extremism and voice support for Ukraine. This was broadcast on all the mainstream media. However, this was in response to just as large of a protest, I think, also tens of thousands the other way. Czechs rally against NATO, or whatever you want to call it, to demand So 7 days ago, you got thousands rally for a resignation of their government because they think that protest, check NATO and EU membership. Tens of thousands protest, not covered by mainstream. Okay, but here's the protest one way. Okay, this is, again, demonstrators gathered telling the administration to resign. A couple of days later, counter-protest the other way. So similarly, this happened in Ukraine. And I was trying to explain that none of these things are new or unique. Okay, whether it's Houthi rebels in Yemen or whether it's people here, you need ways to de-escalate the conflict. Instead, Russia started to support the separatists in the Donbass region. So let's look at a map of Ukraine again. So we got the Svoboda Party. I think this map really helps to explain what happens. The idea of the nation with an eye through it, that's the Wolfsangel symbol. Here, in 2012, you could see these regions here, especially these blue ones, they are looking to go and be with Russia. This is Kherson over here, that's Crimea over here. You got Donetsk and Luhansk. You got over here, you got Kharkiv. Now more and more people know about these. So the demonstrators in these cities were all put down, Odessa, Kharkiv. But here, with the border with Russia, Russia decided to help these separatists and give them arms. Also, there was a Crimean referendum as a result of the Odessa fire and others fearing that the nationalists will come and wreak havoc in Crimea. There was a referendum passed. In fact, there were referendums passed in Donetsk and Lugansk and everywhere. Not right now, but we're talking about 2014. The referendums on the status of Donetsk and Lugansk back then were passed. And they intended to legitimize the establishment of so-called republics. So again, so-called republics. Countries don't like these kinds of things. Okay? Who decided to support these? The Russians did. Kind of a dick move, Russians, because, you know, if you hadn't done that, then Ukraine would have put down the protests, and just like they did in Kharkiv. But again, the U.S. does this all the time. For example, in Nicaragua, where they have the Contras, where Reagan was secretly supporting people against the government there, and so on. The United States helped Panama secede, for example. And then they, had resources like the Panama Canal and so on, helping them. So countries do this a lot. We helped the Syrian rebels, the Free Syrian Army. We helped so many different uprisings if we didn't like the group. On the other hand, we helped the Saudis the other way. So Russia does this, and it turns into a really big mess because Russia kept propping up these rebels for years. They sent in trained soldiers, kind of like the United States had Manuel Noriega. Manuel Noriega was trained in something called the School of the Americas. And later, the United States had to invade Panama to get him out. But they trained him in the first place. And then he went and took over Panama. So similarly, this guy, Igor Girkin, who took on the name Strelkov, he went ahead and helped organize these breakaway, these separatists, okay? And if you look at separatists, whether it's the Tamil Tigers or the PKK, okay, what you see is that there's a lot of attacks. And basically, this became a civil war. It became a war that there's millions of people, as you see, like in these regions, there's a lot of people. This is Odessa. Where did they go? They kept living there, and they kept living under bombs. So here's where it gets pretty bad on both sides. Russia had a dick move of supporting these. The Ukrainian government, on the other hand, started to get weapons from essentially Western nations, and we've seen this already. The human rights groups, for example, demanded Israel to stop sending weapons. But look at human rights groups ask Israel to stop arming. So again, as late as 2018, people were describing it like this. But NATO armed a lot of these militias, not directly. They, just like we didn't arm the Al-Nusra Front directly or anything like this. But we did help train a lot of Ukrainians to fight and retake the territory. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian government started using things like cluster bombs. Cluster bombs were used. This is we're talking about October 2014. Here's Human Rights Watch. Widespread use of cluster munitions. Government responsible for cluster attacks on Donetsk. October 14th. So this is Human Rights Watch. They spoke about this, and the New York Times reported this. Back then, it was mainstream. The Ukrainian army appears to have fired cluster munitions on several occasions into the heart of Donetsk, unleashing a weapon banned in much of the world into a rebel-held city with a peacetime population of more than 1 million, according to physical evidence and interviews with witnesses and victims. Why is this important? Now, not a lot of people were killed, but just to show you, these cluster bombs, the reason they're so egregious is because they're banned in a lot of countries except the United States, Ukraine, and Ukraine and Russia still use them. The United States hasn't banned them either. If you look at, what was I going to say? What happened in Bucha, the Guardian found that a lot of the civilians were killed by cluster bombs and also metal darts from tank artillery. It's called flechettes. This is shrapnel, essentially submunitions that explode and impale people. A lot of the people, way more than were found on the road, dozens of bodies that were exhumed, they all showed signs of killed by tiny metal arrows from shells. Ridiculous. So yes, of a type fired by Russian artillery. Just to be clear, a lot of these titles, like from Russian artillery, it's the type. The reason I emphasize this is that Ukraine was also using Soviet-era weaponry and cluster munitions as well, even in these battles. And so, regardless of who it was, the two armies try not to kill civilians, but when they go ahead and fight in civilian areas like Bucha, which is a affluent neighborhood of Kiev, when they were fighting among civilians, a lot of civilians were dying. That's why even right now with this current war, as long as the war stays away from civilian centers, it's really bad that, men are being conscripted against their will, sent to the front lines on both sides and fighting. But you could argue, okay, but that's the army. Civilians, women, children are not there. But then you have the incursions into Kherson. For example, as we speak today, there's a martial law, and at this point, it looks like it might be. Oh, look at that! The Russian army is pulling out of Kherson. So it could be that these armies go back and forth. Ukraine retaking land. Perhaps the war can end with Ukraine retaking all the land and driving the Russians out, and that's it. But if the Russians start retaking land the other way later in a couple months, then the question becomes, what happens to the civilian population? Not only do the armies go back and forth, and a lot of people get killed in the crossfire, but also the collaborators. It's really weird, but like Ukraine cleans up collaborators, and so does Russians, right? So this idea that even like after you are done, it's liberated, whatever, they're going to go and hunt people and try to figure out what happens. Sometimes that means killing people with no due process. Sometimes this even happens at the highest levels. So peace negotiator, one of the people selected by Zelensky was apparently shot dead in what they say is an attempted arrest by the Ukrainian Security Service, the SBU, kind of like the KGB of Ukraine. It's an interesting and scary time for some of these people who flee in various directions depending on who they collaborated with. Just recently, for example, in Kharkiv, which, people fleeing cars, fleeing, I guess, into Russia, into Donetsk. Who are these people? I guess they're collaborators. They would, be considered collaborators, but what did they do? Cars choke roads as Ukrainians flee Russian invaders. This is February 25th. I'm getting way too ahead of myself. Basically what happened was Ukraine started using these things. Russia then continued arming the rebels even further. Shelling resumes in the Donbass. Notes from the front line. This is what it looked like. These days I talk to locals a lot. They're unanimous. They want to avoid fighting unless there's no other option. Okay, they want to avoid fighting. So who were the people who were bringing the fighting there? It was Igor Girkin. It was these guys who had names like Motorola. And they created this weird dystopian government in Donetsk where even these guys admitted that it turned into a hellscape. So the whole project that Russia sponsored, okay, which basically became complete nonsense. Basically even these people said that it's complete, hell in there. And even Zelensky says it, even though they're the ones actually shooting in there for so many years as well. overall, I would say that Russia, by sponsoring the proxy war in Donetsk, indirectly and directly escalated the conflict, which could have just died down. And Russia, then on the other side, NATO was arming the rebels in Ukraine. I'm sorry, NATO was arming the army in Ukraine. So NATO training Ukraine basically to fight. So you could go back before 2019 and you could see a lot of people being trained. These days, because Russia had decimated a lot of the earlier NATO forces, you could read about how the new Ukrainian forces, you could read about the new Ukrainian army. It's essentially NATO-led, NATO-trained. You have people coming from the International Legion, kind of like the Afghan Arabs, the foreign fighters. So today Russia is facing a hybrid army that's essentially getting NATO intelligence and drones and other things, including from all kinds of NATO armies countries. So Russia is unlikely to win, in my opinion, long term, because how can you fight against all those countries? Especially when you also have all those countries' weapons, and you have all these Ukrainians who are willing to use the weapons. It doesn't even matter who's pressing the button. The weapons is what is important. So let's just finish up. So, like I said, we see today, as even if the Russians were going to win, we're going to start to get essentially these escalations from NATO itself, from the U.S. Army itself. You're going to start getting these essentially groups of people who are being deployed, these professionals, and that any miscalculation could lead to World War III. So going to 2019, commentators like Arestovich, who is now the advisor to Zelensky, they anticipated Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Zelensky's advisor now, Arestovich, but back then he was a commentator, he's kind of like Kellyanne Conway. He was essentially saying that he prefers for there to be a big war with Russia. Of course, he is not going to personally go and fight in it, nor is his family, but all these other people will, and he prefers that there be a large war because then Ukraine will get into NATO. He doesn't like the alternative, which is to be, quote, absorbed by Russia within 10 years. I don't know what that means, but he doesn't really clarify it. He just says it's bad. And being that this guy has influence on Zelensky and the government, you can see why Zelensky was swayed from his original position, which he ran on, which is to bring peace. Zelensky mandate to bring peace and to negotiate with Russia, to then essentially doing the opposite. According to Sheer Post, siding with Ukraine's far right, U.S. sabotaged Zelensky's peace mandate. So all throughout this this time, we had the Normandy format meetings between Vladimir Putin and the presidents of Ukraine, successive presidents. 2014, these were brokered by France and Germany, by the way, but also by Belarus, which is why they're known as the Minsk agreements, some of these. So they met in 2014, they met again, they got the Minsk 1 or 2, they were international agreements, peace agreements, that all they have to do is implement. You can go and read why those didn't work. France, Germany, Russia, Ukraine met again and again. And they would have met again in 2022, but Putin launched the invasion. But you could see that all these times diplomacy was attempted by France and Germany, brokered, and it did not succeed. Why did it not succeed? And Belarus, by the way, that's where Minsk is located. So while France and Germany were trying to broker a peace between Russia and Ukraine, by the way, this guy ran on a mandate to achieve this peace. Why did it not succeed? One reason is because Ukraine was being welcomed into NATO by NATO countries, including the United States and UK. The United States and the United Kingdom were not really so much involved in brokering peace. And according to, for example, Sheer Post, they were doing quite the opposite. They were empowering the right-wing warhawks and the far right. We chose to side with Ukraine's far right, who, according to some people, threatened Zelensky to kill him. And as we know, the Azov battalion, for example, and others said, if these guys make any peace with Russia, we are going to march on the government and take them out again. Zelensky ran as a peace candidate. He won an enormous mandate to make peace. That means he has to negotiate with Putin. But there was one major obstacle. Ukrainian fascists, according to this guy, have said they will remove and kill Zelensky if he continues along this line of negotiating with Putin. His life is literally being threatened by a quasi-fascist movement. Look, if the United States supported the peace, that'd be one thing. You could listen to this guy. You can listen to a lot of people on Tulsi Gabbard's show, etc. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there's so many experts on the intricacies of these politics that you could listen to. I'm not going to get into it right now. But what I want to draw your attention to finally is a war that happened in 2008 along very similar lines. In 2008, Saakashvili, Michael Saakashvili was a president of Georgia. And basically, Saakashvili studied in the United States and got really confident when NATO welcomed Georgia into NATO. Okay, so basically, at the time, it wasn't Putin, it was Dmitry Medvedev, I think, who was serving as a president of Russia between 2008 and 2012. And in fact, it wasn't Putin. People say Putin. Medvedev is quite the war hawk himself. But what happened was that Saakashvili's foreign policy was characterized by pro-NATO, pro-EU. As you can see, it's always the same thing. It's different countries trying to tear smaller countries away from, in this case, the control of the Black Sea, this and that. They're trying to get these countries to come in. So in his foreign policy, maintain close ties with the U.S. as well as NATO countries. He sees membership in NATO as a promise of stability in Georgia. Sound familiar, right? And so what happened was he started basically to kind of become militarily. Let's put it this way: Georgia had these other nationalist groups, Abkhazia and Ossetia. Here's North Ossetia, which is within Russia. There's South Ossetia within Georgia. In the breakup of the Soviet Union, what happened was that Georgia became, had these regions which considered themselves to be independent people. And so Georgia started to kind of dominate them in their markets, their economies, and they pushed back. Russia, on the other hand, was ready to defend them, and then Saakashvili's government got really confident with the NATO backing, which back then NATO was slightly backing them, slightly telling them, okay, we're on your side. And they went ahead and started shelling these regions. Well, the Russians were already here and responded with an invasion of Georgia. So you can read all about it here. Abkhazia wasn't really doing much at all, but you could argue maybe South Ossetia was in fact oppressing its Georgian minority inside here. And so eventually, as you can see, is the Black Sea Fleet. This is an important strategic region for Russia. So Russia basically invaded Georgia, but here's the big difference, is that when Russia went and invaded Georgia, 4 days later, the war was over. The war was over, having displaced 192,000 people. And the Russian forces had temporarily occupied Georgian cities. However, this is what happened. Oh yeah, an information war was waged, just like we have here. But here's the big difference. Nicolas Sarkozy, the president of France, personally negotiated a ceasefire agreement. And since then, if you read, Georgia has not been at war with Russia. Yes, Georgia does not have control over these regions as it used to, but the people still living there still live there, and everything remains the same. It's like I told you with these flags. It doesn't matter so much even on that local level. And so the Russo-Georgian War was ended in a few days. And so Russia thought maybe it can intimidate Ukraine the same way this time, except instead of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they had those two other regions, which were breakaway republics now. They went ahead and recognized them as independent republics this year in February. And then you got here the basically Russia had thought that, hey, they'll just go and intimidate Kiev in this case instead of Tbilisi. They'll go ahead and here's Tbilisi, the capital. So the tanks were slowly going towards Kiev, right? So before we get to the invasion and the recognition of these breakaway republics, I do want to kind of talk about what. Where is this? Okay, I don't have it here, so I'm just going to have to show you. In 2021, Ukraine started winning in the Donbass region. For a while, there was a stalemate for many years, and the conflict kind of died down a little bit on a low level. Still, 15,000 people died. There's a lot of intermittent back and forth, as they call badminton, shooting. But This is in 2021. Tension between Russia and Ukraine skyrocketed after Russia's military buildup along the border. The border buildup was largely in response to Turkey giving Ukraine drones. Back then, these were the Bayraktar drones, who famously helped Armenia, who helped Azerbaijan defeat Armenia in their border war about Nagorno-Karabakh. A war, by the way, on Russia's border, again, like near Russia. And again, it's flaring up again. And the question is, what is Russia going to do about that? They've already pledged to help Armenia. So there's so much. These people just need to stop. They need to use diplomacy. Anyway, in 2021, the Bayraktar drone was sent into action, and it just blew up all these tanks. Okay? And so experts argue that the attack had sent a message to Moscow of Kiev's ability to hit Russia without crossing disputed airspace. Ukraine's use of Turkish drones could be a complete game changer, which is why Moscow seems so preoccupied. November 2021. When they say that this war was unprovoked and unjustified, just like every other war, they say that, think about this, unprovoked. This invasion followed essentially a bunch of escalation. Also followed calls for NATO to join, for Ukraine to join NATO. So this was before 2022. Okay. So back then, Ukraine joining NATO guaranteed to start World War III. Russian official says. Russians kept saying these are our red lines. It's just please don't touch Georgia and Ukraine. Please don't invite them into NATO. And NATO, on the other hand, was welcoming Ukraine to some extent. And there was all of this weird sort of provocation. Privately, they told Zelensky they're not joining. Okay. However, you get all of these people, I guess, who want Ukraine to join NATO. It's 2021. Stoltenberg, when he took over in NATO, had these disastrous policies, I guess. A lot of these groups were talking about. So Russia and Putin sent this last-ditch effort to try to say, please say unequivocally that you will never take Ukraine into NATO, right? And instead of talking to him, NATO was like, nah, we could do whatever. Any country can decide its own security arrangements. Would NATO feel that way? Would Turkey feel that way about its neighboring countries? Would the United States feel that way if China decided that Mexico is going to host missiles? At least for Russia's interest, it would seem that it would not simply allow something like that to happen. And Tulsi Gabbard went on Tucker Carlson's show.
So quick democracy check.
And said, all of this could have been avoided. Here's what she said back then about this.
NATO leadership done this situation could have been prevented. I think that not likely to ever happen, and something that is illegitimate. If President Biden and NATO had done exactly what you were just talking about, in agreeing, hey, we're going to take NATO off the table for Ukraine, something that both the U.S. and NATO have agreed is not likely to ever happen, and something that is a legitimate security concern for Russia, that they won't accept having U.S. and NATO troops on their border within Ukraine. Had the U.S. and NATO leadership done this situation could have been prevented.
Perhaps it could have been prevented. People have all kinds of narratives about why Mr. Putin does this or that, or we're going to read the tea leaves of Mr. Putin's ideas. But in fact, it's not Mr. Putin who is only responsible there. In fact, Putin is criticized all the time by war hawks inside Russia who say he's not doing enough. These are the people who demand that we do, in all countries, that we go ahead and attack or invade. Okay? So war hawks exist in every country. Here we had John Bolton, who these are the people who always demand that we do more. And Donald Trump fired this guy who never saw a war he didn't like. So similarly, the war hawks, okay? The war hawks demand essentially more. And this has been the case the entire time. So it's not just Putin. just like in the Iraq War. There's many war hawks, neocons who wanted democracy in Iraq to bring our own form of government, and pro-American and so on. The point being that whether it's Dmitry Medvedev invading Georgia, or whether it's Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine, the hope that they have, and that the United States had and everything, is that they're going to quickly invade and they're going to capitulate. Everyone's going to capitulate and give up these little regions, and then they're going to say, all right, we're never going to join NATO. Similarly, when the United States invaded Iraq, there was shock and awe. Okay? And that's basically what we wanted to do in Iraq. That's what we called it, shock and awe. And it's a military strategy based on the use of overwhelming power and spectacular displays of force to paralyze the enemy's perception and destroy their will to fight. Russia didn't do shock and awe. Shock and awe looks like this. Operation Shock and Awe. Here, footage from... This is what it looks like when the United States does it. This is Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. So think of this as like Kiev. Okay, that's like the entire night. It's just this, and then the next night, and then whatever. So people are like, okay, whatever. We're gonna surrender. That's the idea. Russians did not do this in Ukraine or in Georgia. They had these slow-moving sort of tank, column going into Kiev. Remember this? Almost designed to intimidate the government, give them a time to, reconsider and to, I guess, do this peace agreement. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the peace agreements. So the Russian tanks heading to Kiev, not only did they get ambushed, but I mean, this is ridiculous. They had a multiple miles long. What is this? I mean, is this the way you do shock and awe? Is this how you invade? No, this is the idea is that the Russians probably thought to intimidate Kiev into signing some sort of peace negotiations. But the peace negotiators were not so quick to do it. I spoke to some of these peace negotiators on Facebook, in fact, and there were people begging them to make a peace agreement, begging them in Ukrainian, begging them in Russian. Who knows who these people were, but it seems like they were saying, please avert the war. One of them was this guy, David Braun, David Arachamia, and Chief Executive Officer of Template Monster. That's a different guy, I think. David Arachamia was elected by Servant of the People, Zelensky, to represent Ukraine. He's famous for wearing a hat in the negotiations. A lot of other people were sent. Now, the thing about that is, for a few days, they could not agree on which city they're going to meet in. So a few days went by. After that, they were flown into, I think, border city in Belarus, where Lukashenko and the peace delegation, he hosted them. And back then, everybody thought, okay, there's going to be some peace. In fact, the peace agreements did move forward. You could read all about the demands from the Russian side. Some of the things you could see. Okay, Kim Iverson. I just want to show this. So back then, this is March. The demands were.
Kim, what's on your radar? What is going on with this war in Ukraine?
This is what some people were saying. So Kim Iverson is an investigative journalist who went to Israel, went to Russia, went to Ukraine, and so on. She reports on these things. This is the perspective that they had on The Hill, this show here. And back then, the demands were as follows. This is what she says.
Should have been over by now through negotiations. Putin's demands have been mostly straightforward, and many think they're doable, and some even believe them to be fairly reasonable. Most importantly, he hasn't changed them since this war began. He's consistently told the various leaders in China, France, Israel, Turkey, and others what he wants, and the goalpost hasn't moved. His main demand is for Ukraine to change its constitution from how it's currently written, asserting its desire to join NATO, to instead stating it will never join. Zelensky has already conceded that Ukraine will not join NATO, but Putin wants it in the constitution.
Few things. It can't. The Ukrainian people have to change their constitution. Putting that aspiration to join NATO or that mandate in the constitution is weird in and of itself. The constitution would normally not a constitution is not the place to have this kind of thing. But once it's there, it's so durable that Zelensky said, I can't get it out. Either the people have to have a referendum to change their constitution, or the Verkhovna Rada, which is the parliament, would have to have essentially a supermajority and vote multiple times to change it. So that was a very high hurdle to even do that. And secondly, Zelensky changed his mind. Whatever Zelensky was promising before, now he's emboldened and says, why would we do that? So remember, this was being talked about, we're saying in, this is March 23rd. So back then, people were hopeful. This is, again, I just want to play this from the beginning for just 30 seconds. This is what people thought back then. Most peaceniks would love to see these two neighbors make up, because they do have to live next to each other. This is what they say.
Tim, what's on your radar?
But what is going on with this war in Ukraine? It should have been over by now through negotiations. Putin's demands have been mostly straightforward, and many think they're doable, and some even believe them to be fairly reasonable. Most importantly, he hasn't changed them since this war began. He's consistently told the various leaders in China, France, Israel, Turkey, and others what he wants, and the goalpost hasn't moved. His main demand is for Ukraine to change its constitution from how it's currently written, asserting its desire to join NATO, to instead stating it will never join. Zelensky has already conceded that Ukraine will not join NATO, but Putin wants it in the constitution. He wants Ukraine to undergo a disarmament process, which Russia is currently doing violently, but he requests that they instead undergo the destruction of the weapons themselves.
That's also pretty hard to convince them to do, especially given the fact that, well, Zelensky then said, where's the security guarantees? And they explored those security guarantees all throughout March. Let's continue.
Wants protection for the Russian language in Ukraine. In certain parts of the country, the Russian language has been forbidden in the public sector, even in areas where the majority of the residents speak Russian as their primary language. Putin also says he wants denazification. And what that means is removing from the government and the military the various openly ultra-nationalist people, organizations, and battalions. Some people...
That pretty much got done by itself. See, that's the thing with all these governments. If they don't do anything, if Ukraine had not cracked down on the protesters, then if Yanukovych had not cracked down on the protesters, he would still be in power and Ukraine would not have any of these crises. If the new Ukrainian government did not wage a brutal war against the separatists, like you see here, right, then Russia would not get involved so much and things would die down. But then Ukraine would have to give them autonomy, which is what the Minsk agreements we're talking about. The Minsk agreements were important. They were an internationally brokered peace agreement. This again, we have here France, Germany, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And we're very happy because they were able, look at them smiling, they're able to get the peace agreement. This is Petro Poroshenko, the tallest one, I guess. They're talking about, okay, all you have to do is withdraw your forces. Like literally, here's the text of the agreement. Immediate and full ceasefire in Donetsk and Lugansk. Pull out all the heavy weapons. Okay, effective monitoring and verification of the ceasefire. A dialogue is about to start on local elections. Okay, provide pardon and amnesty for the combatants and so on. Safe access delivery. Like, these are very reasonable things. And yet, they were not implemented. Leading up to 2022, the successive presidents of Ukraine did not want to really give autonomy to these regions because they felt that it's going to create an opportunity for Russia to control the politics of Ukraine indirectly through the voting bloc that was currently completely disenfranchised. Those people who were in the east of Ukraine could not vote. And of course, so therefore they could not have any influence on who would rule in Kiev. As a result, the Kiev government became more and more detached from the Russian supporting public. And as you could see, a rift has formed that essentially led to increased hostilities. So basically what do we have? We have an agreement that could have ended everything and just and ended all of the hostilities. If every side would simply err on the side of going first and saying, fine, we'll disengage first, then none of this would happen. As it is, though, the war expands and expands.
Point to Zelensky being Jewish, and thus the idea there are Nazis supported by the Ukrainian government is preposterous. But these Nazis don't target Jews. They target anyone who isn't Ukrainian. They are ultra-nationalist, and the people most often caught in their crosshairs are Romans and Russians. They have been supported by the West and Ukraine's government since 2014, and Putin wants them gone. Putin also wants Crimea declared as part of Russia. Now, this is a tougher sell for most people because they view it as a symbol of Russian expansion. But many of us know the Crimean people never fought back against Russia in 2014 because most of them actually welcomed being made part of the country. The region was given to Ukraine in the 50s without the consultation of the people living there. The people overwhelmingly declared their desire to rejoin Russia and even celebrated their arrival. The Donbass region is where things get more complicated. Putin demands demands the region be declared its own independent nation. But the question is, how much of the region? Some of the Donbass hasn't even been under the control of Ukraine since 2014. The people in that area celebrated Russia's arrival and viewed them as liberators. Many of them have fled into Russia to escape the war. But the full territory of the Donbass is larger than what has been under rebel control. And that's the area, including Mariupol, which will be a sticking point for the two countries. But everything else is fairly reasonable. Zelensky could have conceded some of these things to at least get to a ceasefire while they figure out the Donbass region. So why isn't Zelensky doing it? Why is the U.S. supplying Ukraine with more weapons and encouraging Zelensky to fight rather than seek peace?
Well, for the U.S., I mean, they're not losing any people, and their weapons get used, and they get to see how those weapons are being used. And at the same time, they are helping a country oppose Russia that previously was an ally of Russia and a friend of Russia. So overall, for the U.S., it's a net win. I could see why the U.S. is doing it. On the other hand, the Ukrainian people are essentially every rocket that is sent to Ukraine explodes typically over Ukrainians' heads. I mean, it seems like it's great. You can send defensive weapons, but when you're sending offensive weapons, it can shoot into population areas in Donetsk. Those people are Ukrainians, aren't they? So if they are, then why are you shooting at them? On the other hand, if they're not Ukrainians, then why are you trying to annex them and liberate them back to being under you? All of these considerations seem to be contradictory if you look at it through the lens of the international system that we have today. Are they part of your country or not? If they're part of your country, then why are you shooting at them? And, what is your hope? That they're going to love you afterwards? On the other hand, if you're an invader, what are you doing undermining the other country? A better approach, and one that would not lead to nuclear war, is if we treat these things like we treated them back in 2014, in 1954. Basically, you don't stress out over which flag is over what. But today, we're just as passionate about these things as Christians and Muslims were during the Crusades. It's far more important to win and make sure to defend a border than it is to let people just live their lives and relegate these things to ideas that perhaps have fuzzy borders, or perhaps, have agreements that are not even so monolithic. Perhaps someone will provide roads and someone else will provide policing. And the next year, the contracts can be renewed with the police agency, but the roads will be administered by someone else. That's a world which I think 200 years from now we could see. But for now, we have the nation states. We have the United Nations that's composed of nation states. And in that system, we're going to see this volatile potential for conflict and getting into World War III. So enough of that. I was able to sort of give you the background on all of the groups and what they were reacting to and talking about. In particular, the Russian invasion, seems to be that a reaction to Ukrainian use of drones in 2021. Zelensky also saying that they're coming after Crimea next. So the rhetoric, for whatever reason, instead of following the Minsk agreements and withdrawing and normalizing relations, it seems like outside countries like UK and US help to inflame the conflict even further and take advantage of, like I said, the historical grievances that people here have with Russia. At this point, I think all of Ukraine has grievances with Russia. So if Russia is ever driven out of Ukraine and the war ends, you can expect decades probably of bad blood between these two neighbors, just like you probably have with Greece and Turkey, and you probably have with the Irish and Great Britain, and so on. But as we have seen, on a nice note, as we have seen that even historic enemies like France and Germany, can eventually learn to live in one peaceful peace next to each other. And one thing that helps is being part of a federation like the European Union. So we can hope that perhaps one day these countries will again form some sort of economic or political unions, or, as I would prefer to see, we could decentralize the power to the people and kind of dilute a little bit these ideas that have become so calcified and solidified when people forget about how much borders change and things change and start to pretend like this will happen and this will stay forever. I prefer that perhaps we could wake up to the reality that people don't want war. The regular people in Ukraine, Russia, France, Germany, the regular people, they don't want the war. It's the politicians who can't seem to negotiate their agreements, can't implement their agreements. It's the media that carries water for these politicians, who will never actually join the war effort, who won't go to the, they won't actually participate in the hostilities themselves, but they'll certainly send a lot of conscripted men to them. So I'd like to see a world where these things pay less, are less of a thing. These concepts are not animating people to kill each other, and transfer of territory is considered an administrative action. Stuff like that would be nice to see, but as it is in 2021, hopefully we don't see this World War III. What do you say? What is this coincidence? This is the freakiest part for me. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Okay. We are going to have Noam Chomsky on the program for the first half. Let me see. I'll be right back with better lighting. Right. Ooh, I actually like that. It just appeared out of nowhere on this thing. Popped in right there. Boom. So this time around, I think a little change of clothes would be good. Kind of like the wartime Zelensky clothing change. All right. Let me see where Noam Chomsky is. I've enabled live transcription. I'm going to be sharing my screen as usual. Oh, there we are.
Starting?
Yeah, how are you?
Okay. You got, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
As well as I can hear, but I can see the transcript.
Well, that's good. It seems that you've added to your beard, and I took away from mine. So it's like I have donated to you.
You leave it alone, it keeps growing till Valeria gets tired of it and cuts it.
Yep, I have something like that myself. So, this is, as you know, this is a program where I talk about politics, and we've spoken before. I'm going to share my screen. There is so much that I want to discuss. I've seen a lot of what you've said recently on Amy Goodman's show and so on. So I won't spend time rehashing it, but I think there are some very, very important developments that we need to discuss. So let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So the way that I normally do this, just to remind everyone who's going to be watching this, is, we go back and forth and I kind of present what's going on, and I would love to get your opinion and your perspective.
Unfortunately, sorry, I can't see the transcript while the screen is there.
Oh, one moment. Are you able to hear me when I talk?
A little, enough barely to make out what you're saying, but okay, let's try.
Let's try. If you're having any difficulty, I'll try to bring back the transcript and just remove the screen share. Okay? All right. So in the first half of this program, we have Noam Chomsky joining us. I wanted to speak about the current events and the nuclear clock and the nuclear escalation that seems to be becoming more and more serious. I also want to go through the history of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and kind of show videos which were from 2014 and 2015 from mainstream sources like the BBC, like The Guardian, PBS, and others. I think it's important to have it all kind of in one place, because I think a lot of people around the world are just sort of experiencing whatever they're being told in their bubble on Earth. And unfortunately, because of these echo chambers, we might be headed to a very bad place with nuclear escalation. As far as I know, Noam, is there anything in place to de-escalate once a nuclear or a tactical nuke has been deployed? Is there anything in the international law that can put the brakes on, let cooler heads prevail, or is it all just making it up as we go along?
Well, there have been, if you go through, I would start even earlier than 2014, but that's a good place. But if you go through the detailed record, What has happened is constant steps in escalation, in making it harder to reach a settlement. This continues right up until days before the invasion. So I don't know if you're going to show this here, but Emmanuel Macron was trying, the leading statesman in Europe, French president, was trying very hard with some German support to reach an accommodation with President Putin that would fend off the war, the invasion. We have the transcripts of his conversation with Putin. It was published in a French journal. You can read them. And it goes up to 4 days before the invasion. Macron was providing options of the kind that are familiar, that I'm sure are there in your presentation. Considerations about neutralization of Ukraine, offering that, referenda in the Donbass region, efforts to move towards a Minsk-style federal arrangement, putting off the question of Crimea, as even President Zelensky has suggested. It's just can't deal with it right now. That's the basic framework, which has been pretty well understood. Putin listened, he didn't reject it, he didn't accept it. And finally, at the very end, 4 days before the invasion, he basically dismissed it with contempt. He said, sorry, I have to go off ice skating. Those were his words, okay? He closed it off. Well, there are continuing possibilities. As the war continues, possibilities narrow. Both sides get more committed, harder and harder to find a settlement. It's the way wars work. The most recent we know of was last April. We have credible evidence that in April, there were Ukraine-Russia negotiations under Turkish auspices, which may have been getting somewhere. We don't have details, but we do know that Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew to Ukraine and informed Ukraine that the US and Britain, he calls it the West, but it means US and Britain, do not want negotiations at this point. He was followed by US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. We don't have a record of what he said, but it's reasonable to suppose that Austin repeated what he has been saying clearly and explicitly for several months, which happens to be official US policy, that the war must continue to severely weaken Russia, which means no negotiations now. That's the most recent thing we know.
So look, we're going to go through a lot of this. And I do want to say that it's very reminiscent of the war in Afghanistan with Brzezinski, talking about essentially the same sort of pep talk that you see here. Just want to play for you really quickly. This is what was said in the 80s, or I should say 1979. This is Brzezinski to the Mujahideen to fight the USSR.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis will be to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long.
Now that is Brzezinski himself. It cuts off there, to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long as they can. Is that the calculus that you think is happening currently with the US and the UK, in the sense that, well, Russia is now in a quagmire, and if they supply weapons endlessly, but not too good, the weapons can't be too good because then Russia will freak out and there will be escalation, but just essentially the same playbook as with Afghanistan to drag it out over several years, because in that war, as we know, 1 million civilians just died. A lot of people died, and there were foreign fighters, which they called the Afghan Arabs, and others coming as well for war tourism and all kinds of things. Is that the kind of situation that you see happening in Ukraine today?
There's a lot of similarity. And I should say that by now, we have detailed information about Brzezinski's role and about from him himself, in fact, and about what was happening through the period of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. First of all, we now have the Russian archives. They've been made public. They're discussed in detail, reviewed in detail by historian David Gibbs. So we have those. We have a detailed study from the highest sources of what happened, how the Russian withdrawal took place. A very important book by Diego Cordovez and Zelig Harrison. Cordovez was the UN official who actually managed to arrange and carry through the Russian withdrawal. Zelig Harrison is a leading journalist and specialist on Afghanistan, highly regarded. Their book is definitive. We have the Russian archives which support them, and we have Brzezinski's own testimony, detailed interview he had in France around 1988, towards the end of the war, in which he describes what was happening. All fits together. What it shows is, to put it very simply, in the words of Cordovez and Harrison, that the US was fighting Russia to the last Afghan. When this is put to Brzezinski, pretty much in those words, who takes credit for it, incidentally, he's not trying to get around it. He says, sure, I initiated Carter, I got Carter to draw the Russians in by military actions that would undermine their government. I'm very happy with what happened, try to drag it out. He's asked by the reporter, what about all the terrible things that happened to Afghanistan? And Brzezinski says something like this. He says, look, what is more important, weakening Russia or a couple of agitated Muslims? That's his phrase. Among those agitated Muslims are 1 million cadavers. But who cares? We were able to weaken Russia. It was a great triumph. So as Cordovez and Harrison put it, the United States was fighting Russia to the last Afghan. Well, let's come forward to the United States and Ukraine. You can now read high-level US commentators, highly placed ones, who are saying the same thing. One of them is John Quigley. John Quigley was the State Department, US State Department representative in the European-based international negotiations to try to deal with the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. His primary responsibility was Crimea and the Donbass. Of course, been involved in it very, very closely since. Can't get higher level than that. He's recently said it's harder and harder to avoid the impression that the US is in Ukraine, is fighting the Russians to the last Ukrainian. Same phrase. Chaz Freeman, highly regarded US ambassador to China, Saudi Arabia, longtime member of the diplomatic corps, said the same thing. Now, it is pretty hard to avoid it. The US policy is continue the war to severely weaken Russia, no negotiations. Virtually the entire world now is holding the opposite. The entire global south is calling for negotiations. That's true even in penetrating Europe. To take Germany, most important country in Europe, of course. Over 3/4 of Germans want to move right now towards negotiations, not the US and Britain.
Where, Dr. Chomsky, where do you get this statistic from? Because that one I could not find on the internet, with 2/3 of Germans or 3/4 of Germans supporting.
I couldn't hear then.
Where do you find this statistic from? The Germans supporting.
Statistics?
Yes.
German press, polls in Germany.
Do you remember which ones?
I mean, I've cited it in print. You can look it up. I don't have them. I don't have it in memory.
I do. So I want to say, I want to just give some evidence for what you're saying in general. Russia has always been hearing from China and India that they would like to see a negotiated settlement, a diplomatic process take place in Ukraine. In fact, we saw that, like you said, the Normandy format. Many people think of Minsk agreements as only taking place in Minsk. However, as we know, Angela Merkel and at that time Hollande and then Macron got Putin together with the presidents of Ukraine, first Poroshenko and then Zelensky. They tried for years. And so that shows that France and Germany as well wanted to see an end to the war. Then we have the Pope, obviously out of the Vatican, just recently begging, here it says that begs Putin, but then right in the subtitle says, calls on Zelensky to be open to any serious peace proposal. I do want to cut into the substance, though. There are certain things that you say and some other people say, certain things that some people say that I don't see much evidence for, and I would like to ask you where you get it from. So there are two alternate stories as to why Ukraine walked away from the negotiations. I personally was in contact with some of the Ukrainian negotiators on Facebook. I have screenshots of people begging them to make a deal with Russia. However, SBU actually killed one of the peace negotiators. So they killed this guy, Denis Kireev, 45, amid the negotiations. I should point out he was selected by Zelensky himself. At the time, the ministry in Ukraine claimed he was a hero, and he was killed during an operation to defend the nation. But the SBU, which is Ukrainians' KGB, claimed that he was a spy. Regardless of what it was, the negotiations did not seem to be super serious because, as you could recall, the first few days they didn't even get to the city. They were shopping, venue shopping, where to go, and then they spent 2 hours or 3 hours and adjourned, and so on. But here is the thing that I saw that the negotiations started to become more serious in March, with Kuleba as well as Lavrov in Turkey, reaching almost agreement on almost every point, Ukraine not being in NATO and so on. But then one of two things happened. According to Ukraine's government, the Bucha massacres and war crimes that they believe occurred there, and that will come out in all of the investigations, we'll see, they made it super hard for them to continue because their people would just not support any sort of peace with such an enemy. On the other hand, you're saying that it was due to Boris Johnson's visit, of which I don't think we have any transcripts. What makes you think that it's more Boris Johnson rather than the contemporaneous events in Bucha that put a nail in the coffin of diplomacy for Russia and Ukraine?
I don't think that, and I didn't say it. I just described what happened. We don't know what the Ukrainian decision was, and it's not my business. I don't give any advice to Ukrainians. It's up to them to decide what they want to do. My concern is the one thing that I am able to influence, that you are able to influence, the acts of the United States. We understand that principle very well. So we honor Russian dissidents who are opposing the Russian war. I don't give a damn what they say about the United States or Turkey or anyone else. I want to know what they're saying about Russia. And by the same principle, we should be concerned with what the United States is doing, what is within the realm in which we can hope to influence. That's what I've kept to. No advice to Ukrainians. It's up to them. I can talk about the consequences, likely consequences of their decisions. That's just like talking about anything else in the world. So we don't know. We know that Johnson's visit informed the Ukrainians that the U.S. and Britain didn't like it. There's every reason to suppose that Austin's visit reiterated the official U.S. policy that he's been repeating over and over, that we don't have a transcript. What made the Ukrainians decide? I don't know. No possible way for me to know. And there's nothing I can say about it. All I can say is that this has been U.S. policy. U.S. policy, in fact, it's official. I don't have to make it up. You can read it. U.S. foreign policy is we must continue the war to severely weaken Russia. In fact, to weaken it severely enough so that we'll never be able to undertake any act of aggression. You think about that for 30 seconds, it means we must weaken Russia beyond what the Versailles Treaty did to weaken Germany, because that was not enough. So it basically means we've got to turn Russia into some kind of agricultural society, kind of like the Morgenthau Plan for Germany. That's official U.S. policy. I'm not making it up. I'm repeating it.
Well, the Versailles Treaty was very punitive by the French because I'm sure they were not happy with their defeat by the Germans earlier. And, the French and Germans used to go back and forth with Napoleon. And so they imposed this treaty, reducing Germany's economy. This was after the First World War, reducing it to essentially there was sky-high inflation, as is famously known, and people needed jobs and so forth. So a lot of times we can get into it, but it seems that sanctions often radicalize the population. The population that is being sanctioned actually rallies behind their leaders. And that happens in Ukraine or Iran that happens in Russia. One thing I want to say, it's not just Putin. Many people say that Putin is behind all this, that if you would take out Putin, then the next guy would simply end the war. And while that could be somewhat of a case, it's very rare even to see the United States do this. So you could say, for example, that Obama drew down the weapons in Iraq and the contractors eventually as well, perhaps. But in most cases, take, for example, the assassination of JFK. During the time of JFK, the war in Vietnam was just getting started. There wasn't a lot of action as far as I understand. But having removed JFK, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, not only expanded the war in Vietnam, but also Laos, for example, where I think Laos was bombed more than any other country in history, according to the History Channel. More than any other country in history. A war that was arguably totally unprovoked and perhaps justified by only one thing, the domino theory, the theory that the US is at war with global communism, which to me sounds very much like denazification, which is one of the justifications that Putin gives, that he believes that if NATO expands, that presents a danger to Russia and its interests. Well, it seems to be similar to how the United States viewed the expansion of communism 3,000 miles away, not even on its border. So my point is, if you remove that, my point is that this seems to be a national thing rather than one guy, which people like to say Putin can't be trusted and so on. But in fact, a poll just came out now, today. Russia, there was a poll that Russia recognizes the referendums, for example, by an overwhelming majority. They consider it to be legitimate. Of course, this is completely the opposite of everyone in the West, which is just what I'm trying to say is it seems that the mass media over the years creates a huge echo chamber in these imperialist countries. And if you replace Putin, it could be that the next guy would be even more hawkish and launch a nuke like Medvedev, for example, or this guy who recently passed away. What was his name? He had his own party. Zhirinovsky. So what do you think? Is it just Putin, or is this more of a problem of entire countries now beating the war drums? And why are they doing it? What's the point for them? What do they hope to gain from escalation with all this?
Well, there are lots of people who are making a career of reading Putin's mind, deciding what's happening in Russia, all based on almost zero information. I don't participate in that. I'm not interested in baseless speculations for which we have almost no evidence about what's happening in Russia. The limited evidence we have, it's quite limited and low credibility, is that Putin is surrounded by a pretty small group of hard men, tough guys, who he has under control, but might have their own interests and might decide to break from him, might well become more hawkish. That often happens, incidentally. There's extensive study of. So Andrew Coburn, good military historian, has a book called Kill Chain, in which he reviews the record of killing off of top guys in a government or cartel or mafia gang and so on. And what he shows is that typically they're replaced by somebody younger and tougher over and over again. So maybe that would happen in Russia. But as I said before, my concern is what I know something about and can hope to influence, not things I know almost nothing about, like everybody else, and have no effect on. That's the opposite of pretty much the way commentary and scholarship works. But it's a position we understand and respect in the case of enemies. It's exactly what we want enemies to do, like Russian dissidents. We just can't do it ourselves. Well, I prefer to take the same stance with ourselves. With regard to the Vietnam War, Kennedy and Johnson, I could run through the details if you like. I've studied it extensively, written extensively about it. I think that picture which you presented, which is the conventional one, does not stand up to the record. JFK was one of the extreme hawks in the administration. Johnson was hoping to keep from the war expanding. Events on the ground changed radically, and Kennedy's most dovish advisors were pressing Johnson to expand the war. Laos was even worse than you described. We know the details. U.S. high-level officials in Laos testified to Congress that the intensive bombing of the Plain of Jars, that's the most intensively bombed in history. The reason for it was that there was a temporary ceasefire in North Vietnam, and the Air Force had nothing to do, so they were sent to bomb the Plain of Jars. That's the testimony.
And also the secretive nature of the war in Laos, which is often called the secret war, to me is very parallel to this idea that Russia has within itself, calling it a special military operation. I understand that legally, if Russia is now, maybe we'll start calling it a war, they will be obligated to use whatever means to defend their country. But there were times when Russians couldn't even believe, couldn't believe that Ukraine is being bombed. So their own family members were calling. Remember, family members, because these countries are neighbors. It's not like the US, which flies 3,000 miles away in order to do some bombing. It's literally next door. And of course, they have to live with each other. And it's an uneasy peace, I understand. Many people dislike the Turkish Empire, for example. The Turks for genocide in Armenia, in Greece. A lot of the Christians resent, and even the Kurds, who sometimes participated in these helping the Turks, they resent the Turks. So I understand when a big empire is resented by Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. Imperialism does not leave a good taste in your mouth. Czechoslovakia. However, it's interesting that the people within Russia did not believe, even their own family members, that it wasn't just the Nazis, quote unquote, that are being bombed. It was more indiscriminate than that. And I think the secret war in Laos against the growing threat of communism after a revolution we didn't like has huge similarities as well. And in this case, the US being you could say the aggressor who is invading and bombing a country because we didn't like their revolution and we didn't like the kind of economic system and the kind of people that they would associate with after that. That seems to be very similar to how, and no less bloody than what Russia is doing in Ukraine with NATO. Is that an apt comparison?
We don't have to look to Ukraine and Russia to find that people in some country support the crimes and atrocities that their country carries out. We can look right here. It's astonishing. On the case of Laos, almost nobody knew about it, so we can't. I mean, I was actually there interviewing refugees from the Plain of Jars, trying to get some information out about it. The person who did most was Arnold Cohen, late Arnold Cohen, who worked there intensively, finally managed to get some attention, but years later. But let's take today. How do people today in the United States react to the wars in Vietnam and Iraq? The Indochina wars were by far the worst crime carried out since the Second World War. The Iraq War was a radical violation of the UN Charter, murderous, destructive war, absolutely no conceivable justification. How is it reacted to in the United States? Well, I'll give you an example. Take the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal of international affairs. Relatively dovish by comparative standards. It's not the Atlantic Council, some super hawkish organization. It's moderately, for example, they do publish articles which break with the establishment position and call for negotiations. So, mainstream liberal journal. They have an article this month, not Arms Control Today. This is Foreign Affairs. They have an article by two highly placed figures, also kind of on the liberal side. One was active in National Security Council and so on, Fiona Hill and Angela Stent. The article is, of course, a major condemnation of Putin, the worst monster in history, and so on. And then there's a condemnation of the global South, the whole global South, because they don't go along with us in this war. They're keeping their hands open to Russia. They're refusing to take part.
Is it like we called the?
Finish?
Sure.
Can I finish? Then they go on to say some leaders, some people in the global South are so outrageous that they even dare to compare Russia and Ukraine with the U.S. operations in Vietnam and Iraq. It's an astounding comment. which would be unbelievable in any civilized society. What they're saying is the two of the worst crime since the Second World War and another major crime were just benign activities. That's in the leading establishment journal. You're not going to see one critical word about it, except from somebody like me. So do we have to go to Russia to find out why people believe state propaganda? We're immersed in it. All the people we meet, all the scholars, all the commentators, all totally immersed in it. No matter how much evidence there is, evidence on these things reaches the sky. Sorry.
No, I love your passion on this, and you have been talking about this for decades. And I think this goes to the heart of what I would like to talk to you about, okay? Which is essentially how the public supports these atrocious wars, and perhaps even wars that could lead to the extinction of humanity on a global scale, which is, you would think, insane. But I want to get into that in a moment. I wanted to just say that it seems that we even shame other countries. I remember when we renamed French fries into freedom fries because France and Germany refused to go along or support the US position on Iraq. And you don't even have to, people say, well, that was 30 years ago. That was 50 years ago. This year, the US occupation of Afghanistan ended with a defeat, by the way, to the Taliban. And of course, they say that they were a good presence there because they were helping girls go to school and get education, which is certainly true that they were doing that. But the Soviets were doing that too in the 80s. And the United States back then, instead of helping the girls in their education, let's say, the United States decided to fund the terror activities against the government of Afghanistan. But we don't have to go into history. Today, right now, this year, Yemen is in its, what is it now, the 8th or maybe 10th year, depending on how you look at it. And the UN says, right, outright catastrophe over rising hunger, right? And you've mentioned before that a lot of their food comes out of Ukraine. At the highest levels, we have the president of the United States, in this case, Donald Trump, said things like, where was this? Defends arms sales to Saudis, saying this will mean really, really many jobs. We're talking about 40,000 jobs in the United States. Look, an industry based on death and knowing how many people are suffering to send weapons to that region, we justify it. We're justifying it now as well, with the hope that the Ukrainians will eventually prevail. But of course, we don't want to give them weapons that are too good to make them win too quickly, because then we might get a nuclear attack by Russia. So it's a very perverse thing to drag out this war for years in order to, as Brzezinski said, bleed Russia dry. Some people say the quiet part out loud. Trump does, Trump did, and so did Brzezinski. So I don't think everyone is pretending like they have good humanitarian reasons. Sometimes it's just about business and geopolitical rivalry, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I lost what the question was. You brought up many different things.
Let me get to the heart of the matter. For decades, you were talking about the body count. You talk about how, for decades, you, Noam, were talking about the body count.
Body count?
The body count. What I mean by okay. A few years ago, you had a dispute. Sam Harris messaged you to defend the new atheists, who you had described believe in the religion of the state, meaning, although they condemn the killing in the name of a religion like Christianity or Islam, they are more than happy to perpetuate messages that justify killing or collateral damage on a huge scale, millions dying or going hungry. And so Sam Harris said to you that you ignore the role of intention. He believed that the intention of the United States in all of these wars, or perhaps in some of them, was noble. And it was to help prevent a genocide, such as, yeah.
There's no reason to believe that the intention of the United States was noble. Of course, the rhetoric is noble, but the rhetoric of everyone is noble. When Hitler took over the Sudetenland, his rhetoric was just overflowing with nobility. He's going to end the ethnic conflicts. He's going to bring to them the benefits of the more advanced German civilization, technology, humanities, just wonderful. And if you had records from Genghis Khan, you'd probably find the same thing. So we don't pay any attention to the rhetoric. We look at the policies, and in the United States, we're lucky. It's a very free society, so unusually so. So we have internal records, extensive ones, and there we can find out what the goals were. So we look at the actual goals as internally discussed and the policies which essentially conform to them. But we don't look at rhetorical claims about intentions. That's just ridiculous. Of course, everybody has noble intentions in rhetoric.
Well, I want to put a little bit of more nuance to this, maybe another perspective that you and Sam Harris didn't bring up. When there is a federal union like the EU or like the USA or China or USSR, for example, then within that union, when something moves from one province to another province, that is considered administrative. For example, the last time that Crimea changed hands from Russia to Ukraine, right, in 1954, no one thought about killing thousands of people as a result, and certainly not escalating to a nuclear war between countries and a world war. Why? Well, it would be just as ludicrous to suppose that World War III would start by a dispute between New York and New Jersey. So I think that once the empire has been established, there are benefits to empires. It's not all bad. So one good thing is that, take the United States, right? We all speak English. When I first met you, I took public roads that went up to Massachusetts. I drove on federal highways. And so people, instead of fighting each other, have a common language, a common federal economy, and they're able to, and a common language and a common science. And so throughout history, empires allowed the science centers to prosper and to improve technology in the world. For example, paper, gunpowder came out of China, but China was a giant empire. Somebody invented it, and then it spread throughout the empire. So what I'm saying is, I think whether it's Pax Romana or Genghis Khan's famous piece that a virgin could go thousands of miles without being molested, I think by having a sort of unity that's already been built up, like the EU, it seems to be a positive force and a framework where the same exact event, in this case, transfer of Crimea from one political entity under another, is not viewed at all through the lens of nationalism and war and territorial integrity.
Great, I lost you. Are you proposing a justification of empire? So like you're favoring Nazi Germany taking over all of Europe? That would be empire.
Well, if you want to take the edge cases, I would say that if Hitler hadn't started killing people in a genocide and all that he did was annex Austria in the Anschluss, let's say, that's all he did, and then the economy improved, he would probably be considered a good leader if that's all he did. And that would be strictly better than Austria not being part of this economy during the time of a Great Depression.
We have to make a couple of distinctions.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between Nazi Germany taking over Europe and unifying it, and between the European Union, which is a union of independent states that came together to join for the common good. European Union is certainly much better than a lot of warring states. I mean, for centuries, the states of Europe had been slaughtering one another. So to move towards the point where France and Germany can be allies, and you can drive from France to Germany without going through a checkpoint, and a French student can study in a German university and so on. That's a big advantage over slaughtering each other. But that has absolutely nothing to do with imposing imperial control, like the Russian Empire or the American Empire or the Nazi Empire. These are just totally different things.
Well, perhaps I'm using the wrong terminology. Let's just say federal union or federation. However it came about, it's now, they speak the same language now, right?
Not the same language. European Union, dozens of different languages. In fact, it's very questionable. It's very questionable whether the move towards national languages in Europe is positive. Now, that's an open question. There are plenty of people in Italy, for example, who can't talk to their grandmother because of the process of Italian unification, which has wiped out dozens of languages. You can debate whether that's good or bad, but the European Union didn't impose a common language. It's keeping the national languages and much of the national cultures. Exactly how much? That's a matter of great conflict within Europe. One of the things that the European Union did was undermine democracy severely by transferring fundamental decisions away from the national states, where the public has some influence, to Brussels, an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels, the Troika, European Commission, European Central Bank, IMF. They're free. They're just autocrats. Don't respond to anyone. And that's where central decisions are. It's part of what you see behind the rise of the far-right nationalist movements in large parts of Europe, in Italy a couple of days ago. These are movements which in part are reacting to the undermining of democracy, of sovereignty, by moving decisions to an unelected troika in Brussels. So there's all sorts of problems. But these are totally different from imperial domination. That has nothing to justify it.
I guess, okay, let me shift gears, because I want to ask you your opinions. I promised people that I would ask you a few questions that about your views to clear things up, okay, if that's all right. One is, Russia has been condemned on an international level by the UN. This year, the UN voted to kick Russia off of the Human Rights Council, for example, overwhelmingly. How do you view the UN's position on this vis-a-vis Russia? Does that mean Russia is the worst violator of human rights? Is this war uniquely worse than every other? How do you approach seeing that a majority of nations condemn Russia at the moment?
They should condemn Russia. Majority of nations constantly condemn the United States. Take a look at the votes on Cuba every year. 184 to 2. 2 are the United States and Israel, which automatically has to vote for the United States. And take the invasion of Iraq. Virtually nobody supported it. Take, in fact, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, strongly supported here. There were international Gallup polls taken. They were kind of marginalized here, but they're there. Almost total opposition. People in the world said an intervention could be justified if it had been shown that they knew who the perpetrators of 9/11 were. But of course, they didn't know. They didn't know long afterwards, which meant that almost the entire world opposed the invasion of Afghanistan. Almost everything in the United States, overwhelmingly what the United States does is opposed. What Israel does with U.S. backing is opposed. UN can't do anything about it. Nobody ever suggested that the U.S. be thrown out of the Security Council because of its invasion of Iraq, or because of the war in Vietnam, or a dozen other things. The U.S. is just too powerful. Can't do it. If anything like that was done, the U.S. would destroy the United Nations. Everybody knows that. In fact, when the U.S. is the one country which has rejected a judgment of the World Court, condemning it, ordering it to terminate its acts of terror. Does anybody care? Does anybody even know? Who cares? So much for the World Court. Who are they? The New York Times took care of it when the World Court made its judgment. He said, who cares about the World Court? They're a hostile forum. Why are they a hostile forum? Because they condemned the United States for international terrorism, ordered it to desist. So since they're a hostile forum, we don't care. That's the New York Times, the liberals. And that's our country, okay? I mean, you asked before, why do the people accept that? Well, I'm not sure they do, and it's not my concern. My concern is with the groups that you and I are part of, the intellectual classes, the commentariat, as they're called, the people who write articles and express opinions, people who have high level of education. It's my circles, your circles. I'm concerned with them. You take a look at the population, it's a very mixed story. And I'll give you one example. At the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, everybody had to make a comment on it, and you had a whole range of comments. And we can read them. They ranged from hawks to said we were stabbed in the back by the anti-war movement. If we'd fought harder, we could have won. That's the right wing. You go way to the left, far to the left as you can go. Anthony Lewis in the New York Times, Dove, critic, anti-war, and he had an article which said the United States, we entered the war with benign efforts to do good, Why? Because it's us. We don't have any evidence for it. So by definition, we entered with benign efforts to do good. But by 1969, it was clear that it was a mistake, and we couldn't bring democracy to Vietnam at a cost acceptable to ourselves. The most vulgar apparatchik in the Soviet Union couldn't sink lower than that. And that's the left end of the intellectual community that can be reached in the United States. Now, as it happens, there were studies of public opinion. Chicago Council of Foreign Relations carries out extensive studies of public opinion. So what was the public saying in 1975? 70% of the public said the war was not a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral. And that, as long as they asked the question, another 15 years or so, got the same answer. Then something quite interesting happened. The social scientist who runs the programs, liberal, good, solid social scientist, John Riley, finally asked, what do people mean when they say the war is fundamentally wrong and immoral? They didn't do a poll to find out. He just told us, because it's obvious. What they meant is they thought too many American soldiers were dying. Maybe, or maybe they thought it was fundamentally wrong and immoral. In our intellectual culture, can't even ask that question, okay?
Well, to me, that is the key thing. If you can value the lives of Yemenites or Libyans, then you would be talking about the millions that had to live in a failed state after our invasion of Libya. But instead, we only spoke about the 4 Americans in Benghazi. And the reason that we don't like the Saudi regime is because they assassinated Khashoggi, a journalist with ties to the United States, not because they're bombing Yemenites or millions of Yemenites.
It's normal. It's what we do to those other people just doesn't matter to the intellectual classes. About the population, I'm not sure. We have plenty of evidence to the contrary. So take during Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America, murderous terrorist wars. There was a popular reaction in the United States from the grassroots, not particularly organized. It came from evangelical churches in the Midwest, all over. For the first time in history, in the history of imperialism, first time, people in the imperial society didn't just object, which is rare enough, but actually went to live with the victims, to help them, to give them the protection of a white face. It's an unbelievable event, pretty much wiped out of history. Intellectuals don't want to hear about this kind of stuff, but that's a popular response to the crimes of the state, mostly supported by the intellectual classes.
Well, I want to ask you about one other thing, the intellectual classes within Ukraine. I think it's important to understand that in each country, the media and the commentators really affect how people think. I want to play for you this 1.5-minute clip. You could see the captions right here, the translation, and I want you to react to it. This is the advisor to Zelensky. His name is Alexei Aristovich, and you could think of him as like Kellyanne Conway with Trump. Before he was with Zelensky, he was a commentator and a critic. It is in this capacity that he gave this interview in 2019. And this is what he said.
Получает выдачи в НАТО, то тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию, для которой у нас неохота.
То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно, Россия не НАТО. Они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО. Перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9% наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет. Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирать Зеленского.
Подождите, а теперь если поставить чашу на весах, а что лучше в таком случае?
Конечно, крупная война с Россией и переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией.
Что такое может быть крупная война с Россией?
Это воздушная операция, наступательное вторжение российских армий, 4, которые они создали на наших границах, там осада Киева, попытка окружить войска, которые в РТО находятся, операция объединенных сил, прорыв через Крымский перешейк, выход на Каховское водохранилище, чтобы воду в Крым дать, наступление с территории Беларуси, там создание новых народных республик, диверсии, удары по объектам критической инфраструктуры и так далее, воздушный десант. Вот что такое полноценная война. И вероятность ее 99%.
Когда?
После 21-22 самые критические, 20-22 самые критические.
In other words, he is predicting this, but his opinion is it's preferable to have a big war.
New reporting this morning, CNN has learned that the
it's better to have a big war in Russia with Russia because he believes the alternative is that Russia will consume. He doesn't go into specifics, but consume Ukraine. in 10 years. So that's the what is your reaction to this line of thinking?
I'm afraid this is another example of the distinction between us. Your focus is on other people we have nothing to do with, we can't influence. My focus is the same as our attitude toward Russian dissidents. We shouldn't be concerned with ourselves and what we can do something about. I don't happen to agree with his analysis, but it's not my business. Some Ukrainian says, here's what I think. Up to him to say what he thinks. You want to know my opinion about what he thinks? I can tell you, but I don't give him advice.
Well, he's the advisor to the president.
My opinion about what he thinks is that if Ukraine had moved directly to joining NATO, it would have been wiped out, along with the rest of us probably. Okay? And he's omitting an alternative. Let's find a way to settle the problem without invasion. And there were ways. For example, the Minsk framework was a way. Now, he may say, I don't like that. Okay, up to him, not me. I am not in a position to order other people what to do. All right? I want to say that the United States should have been, us, you and me, should have been working to act to make something like a Minsk-style settlement possible and avoid any invasion. Instead of moving Ukraine, as we were doing, to be integrated into the NATO command with an enhanced program, they're Biden's words, not mine, an enhanced program to join NATO. Instead of doing that and interoperability of US military programs with Ukrainian ones, instead of doing that, we should have been joining with France and Germany to try to move towards avoiding any conflict at all. That's us, you and me. What Ukrainians say is up to them.
Well, that's my question to you. There have been so many people in the United States, people like Ron Paul, people like Tucker Carlson or Tulsi Gabbard, all across the spectrum, Bernie Sanders. There have been people, influential people within this country, like Bernie Sanders, talking about how the United States should stop engaging in these regime change wars. Hasn't worked.
That's
Hasn't worked.
A different story, totally different story. Sanders has very little to say about foreign affairs, but as you said, he's talking about regime change. That means aggression to overthrow governments. Yes, he's opposed to that. But I've heard him say nothing on the Ukraine war, which is relevant to what we're discussing.
Yes, my point is that for decades, you have focused on being a dissident and empowering other dissidents, and that's good. But my question to you is, where we are different is, if we are concerned about an issue, like let's say women's rights, let's say human trafficking, we should look at where it's the worst. And as an international community, we should highlight that for everyone in the world to see. For example, caste rapes in India, or how China locked up Uyghurs in camps. Those things, the first step is to highlight that. By navel gazing only at your own country, what if your country is Morocco? You would be wasting your time globally. You could be helping expose crime.
Let's make our difference clearer. I agree with you that we should, but you and I disagree on the focus. You say we should do it in the case of other people's crimes, but avoid our own. I say the opposite. We should be focusing on our own because those are the ones we can change. Yes, we should highlight women's rights suppression in Iran. And in fact, I do it, made many statements. But even more so, we should highlight human rights violations in Saudi Arabia because there we can influence it. In Iran, we can't. So I take the position of the Russian dissidents. We should focus our efforts on attention on things we can do something about. Your position is the opposite. We should focus our attention on things we can't do anything about, but we can blame on some enemy.
No,
that's what you're saying.
Just to be clear, you yourself
that's the
said
difference I see.
Your own.
I don't see any other difference.
Well,
I see no other difference.
Well, can I clarify? Your own quote.
I make strong statements protesting Iranian repression right now. In fact, the last couple of days. I hope you do too.
Of
yes,
course.
We should all do that. But we should pay, our focus of attention should be on what we can change. Okay.
Well, I happen to be able to change things without going through the US political system. Me personally, I have companies that you know about that build software for people globally. And so people can...
Fine, then use them. I have plenty of contacts abroad too, which I use. But the main focus of our energy Just accept the principle. The main focus are on what we can do. That's the opposite of the standard position. The standard position is we should focus on what we can't do anything about, but we can blame on an enemy. Let's take the Uyghurs. We should protest that. We should protest even more what we are doing to 2 million people in Gaza. What we are doing, you and me. That's what we should be focusing
Well,
on.
this is where I fundamentally disagree with you, if I may, Dr. Chomsky, is that as a libertarian, you are now able to create software for people to inform each other and to self-organize without the machinery of the state, even the one you live in. If you've been trying for decades to affect U.S. foreign policy, I haven't seen any result. You've been the most.
Sorry, but you've seen many results.
Sure.
So we don't disagree at all on what you're now describing. If you can set up software which will bring people together, it's fine. I have no disagreement.
But it's deeper than that, because the people are relying on their mass media apparatus. We spoke about this before, whether it's state-sponsored like BBC or RIA News in Russia, or whether it's corporate sponsored and for profit, like you wrote about in Manufacturing Consent. You yourself said that it can be captured by the state, that there are incentives to tell the official story. I want to know what's happening right now in Mariupol. Are people fine? I want to know what's happening in Sana'a, Yemen right now. How can I know this given the current apparatus? I can't. It's completely distorted wherever I live.
A lot of ways to know it. You can read Al Jazeera. You can read international press. You can read documentary evidence. We can read the documents of our own country and find out that a lot of what you were saying just isn't true. So there's plenty of ways to do it. It's much better if you can find web systems to make it even better. I'm all for it. Who could disagree with that?
Thank you. I would love to help stateless populations. Like there's so many now. We're in touch with people who were part of the Rohingya genocide in Burma, which is now called Myanmar. We're in touch with their representatives. There were genocides all over the place. There's a Tamil genocide in Sri Lanka. There is a genocide, just if you think of Bangladesh when it was trying to get independence. My point is this: if you rely on the state, if you rely on the idea that these flags and these countries are the last flag that will ever fly over a specific region, you're going to get people fighting over this idea. And like I said before, if everyone is part of one union, like the Soviet Union or USA, it's laughable. It's risible to think that New York and New Jersey could start World War III. But as soon as the union falls apart, you're starting to get nationalism and flags. So my point is, if you live in one of these countries, whether it's a federal, big federation or whatever, yes, it has a lot of power, and you can try to move public opinion within it to curb most of the, try to stop the wars. But how much success have you seen? You've been at this for 70 years, and just in my lifetime, I've seen the Iraq War, the Libya, destroying Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. I mean, U.S. is at it all the time. So at least I think we need a non-state approach, we the people. What would you say to that?
I would say if you can find a more effective way, by all means do it. Who could object? But there's been the only means that have been available, and in my mind are still available, are the ones that peace activists are doing. And it does have an effect, plenty of effects. I can give you many examples. If you can do something even better, we all applaud. Nothing to debate.
So let me just, in that case, let me turn to Israel just really quickly. Israel and the current status of the Palestinian refugees. The definition of a Palestinian refugee is very important, because when we speak about who is a Palestinian, it's important to understand who are we talking about. And so they are defined as essentially Palestinian Arabs descending from peoples who have inhabited Palestine, but more by the UN definition, the people who were there in 1947. And so there was the Nakba, just for, I'm sure everyone who is watching this is probably aware, the Nakba, essentially there was, you could say, a civil war inside inside Israel, a power vacuum when the British had left. And so during that war, there were many refugees. Now, here's the interesting thing. The refugees that came to the United States got citizenship, and now their children are born with US citizenship. like Rashida Tlaib actually got U.S. citizenship and even got elected to U.S. Congress. On the other hand, in the Arab League countries, there is a policy to keep them stateless. So in other words, you could be born in Lebanon, you could be born there and your parents born there, but then essentially you're never given the same citizenship and the same rights. So if Israel gives a right of return to all Palestinians, they wouldn't be giving a right of return to 700,000 refugees from the Nakba, but rather every person that has even a grandfather, one grandfather from the Nakba has very limited rights. In Lebanon, just this year, they have again said that they're not able to hold professions a second time now this year. And even the Electronic Intifada talks about this starting from 2007. It hasn't improved. So if you are one of the people living in Lebanon, you don't have the same rights as everyone else. And Israel's the only country that gives you a way to have a life. You're going to move there. My proposal, again, just like with everything else, is to have a regional solution so that the Arab League countries simply offer citizenship to the people born there, just like the US does in every Western nation with birthright citizenship. And then after they just make that offer, see how many people take it. And then Israel can give a right of return, because then the people would have a real choice: stay in their country where they grew up their entire life or move to Israel. Right now, it seems like it's being exacerbated as almost like a demographic bomb, time bomb, which makes it almost impossible for any country, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, to take in all of these people. It needs to be a coalition of countries that are cooperating. And I think we've started to see more of that, Israel cooperating with Arab countries, but it's only the beginning. I'd like to see more. What would you say to that?
Okay. As usual, you're taking the position that we should ignore totally what you and I are responsible for. There's a crucial difference between absorbing Palestinians in the United States and absorbing them in Lebanon. The difference is that the United States supports their expulsion from Israel. The United States is overwhelmingly responsible for the oppression of Palestinians. So it's not true, incidentally, in 1948, but it's been true in the last 70 years. You and I are playing a role in crushing Palestinian rights. So yes, therefore, if we accept the U.S. racist imperialist position with regard to Palestinians, we're happy to welcome them here. In Lebanon, Jordan, other places, they don't support the expulsion of Palestinians. So their attitude is different. Now, with regard to their giving citizenship, you're pushing an open door. I've been in favor of this openly, publicly for years before you ever started talking about it. So you don't have to instruct me, but you're missing the critical difference as always. What you're saying is we have to ignore our crucial role. So yes, we should withdraw our role of supporting Israeli violent repression of Palestinians. We should also call for Lebanon giving rights to people in the refugee camps, as I've done often, including the times when I visited the camps and talked to Palestinians there. So sure, that should be a concern, but way down the list when we look at our actual concerns, which would be changing the U.S. policy, which is day by day contributing to this massive suffering and repression.
Oh, I agree that the United States, I agree with you, Dr. Chomsky, I agree with you that the United States is perpetuating and making it comfortable to have, for example, a blockade of Gaza. But what I'm saying is the United States isn't the only actor here. Remember, Gaza was blockaded because the quartet, which included the UN, the US, Europe, and I think it was Russia, I forget, the quartet, they put sanctions on the country. And today, okay, Gaza is blockaded by both Egypt, where there was a military coup and still is being run by people there, and by Israel. Now, what I'm trying to say is I care about regional cooperation. So the leaders of the Palestinians, which you yourself said, you've seen it over the decades. The PLO was on the wrong side in the Kuwait war with Iraq. They sided with Saddam. Kuwait hated them. Arafat said they did worse than Israel to them. In Jordan, they had the Black September, where they literally took on the king of Jordan in a civil war, a state within a state trying to get power. They were kicked out, went to Lebanon, and started a civil war in Lebanon, which led to the rise of Hezbollah, a Shiite group trying to defend itself.
Look, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt because I have to leave.
Okay.
We could go on for hours with your repeating the standard propaganda line, condemning other people for what they do, sometimes correctly,
And ourselves,
sometimes wrongly. But what I am interested in, what we can do about it, okay? And in the case of every one of these things, there's plenty that we could have done about it. I could go through them if you want, but unless we can at least agree on principles, we go on forever. Yeah, you can give a long list of the crimes that other people commit, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. And I am saying, let's talk about what we can do, okay? I'm sorry, but right now I have to leave because I have another commitment.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Chomsky. Perhaps next time we could have a conversation just about Israel. That would be great. Thank you very much.